Before the story starts, picture this. It's the winter of 1946 in the hills west of the Dead Sea, and a teenage shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dihib is doing something he has done 100 times before. He's looking for a lost goat. The land out there is the color of old bone, cliffs and wadis and caves that have sat untouched since before anyone thought to write their names down. He tosses a stone into a dark opening in the rock, just to see if the goat might be hiding inside, and instead of a bleat, he hears something else. A crack, like pottery breaking. He doesn't climb in that day. He's nervous, and honestly, so would you be. But a little while later, curiosity wins, the way it usually does, and he lowers himself into that cave and finds clay jars lined up in the dark, sealed shut, undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years. Inside them, wrapped in linen gone soft and brittle with age, are scrolls of leather and papyrus, covered in a language most people alive at that moment can't read. That accident, a boy chasing a goat into a hillside, is how the modern world got its hands on some of the oldest religious writings ever recovered. Among them, tucked into that quiet, sealed dark for 2 millennia, were fragments of a book that the mainstream Bible left out. A book that claims to explain something Genesis only whispers about. A book that says it knows exactly what was happening on earth in the years before the flood waters rose. It's called the Book of Enoch, and tonight, that's where we're going. Hey buddy, welcome back to the quiet past. If this is your first time here, go ahead and get comfortable, because that's really the whole idea of this channel. We take the long, slow, half-forgotten corners of history, the parts that never make it into the loud documentaries, and we walk through them together at a pace that lets your mind finally unclench a little. No jump cuts, no dramatic music stings, just a voice, a story, and enough time for you to drift off whenever your body decides it's ready. Go ahead and do whatever you do to get settled. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull the blanket up. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, because I promise you're holding tension up there you don't even notice anymore. If you're the type who likes to have something playing while you fall asleep, you can just let this run in the background tonight and let it carry you. Before we go any further, if you're new here and you find that this kind of thing helps you get to sleep, take half a second and hit that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything, and it means we get to keep making these long, slow histories instead of chasing whatever trend is loud this week. That's really all I'll say about it tonight. No pressure. Just a nice thing to do if this becomes part of your bedtime. I'd also love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it actually is on your clock right now. I'm recording this in the evening quiet, the kind where the neighborhood outside has gone still, and the only sound is the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. But this video reaches so many different time zones, so many different bedrooms, that I like to imagine all of you scattered across the map, each in your own little pocket of night or your own early morning drive. Drop it in the comments if you feel like it. Just your city or your country and your local time. I read them, even the ones that come in months after a video goes up. There's something nice about knowing exactly how far this little story traveled to reach you. Tonight we're doing something a bit different from our usual walk through a single life or a single century. Tonight we're going back to a story that sits underneath so much of what we think we know about the ancient world, a story that was almost lost entirely, and only survives today because of an odd chain of accidents, translations, and one very stubborn Scottish traveler who smuggled manuscripts out of Ethiopia in 1773. We're going to talk about the Book of Enoch. We're going to talk about what ancient people genuinely believed was happening on Earth before the flood came. And we're going to slow down enough to actually live inside that world for a while, instead of just hearing the plot summary version you might already know. I want to be honest with you about something before we start, because I think it matters, and because this channel has always tried to be careful with the truth. The Book of Enoch is not something historians can verify the way we verify a battle or a census or a king's reign. It's a religious and mythological text, written by real people, in a real historical moment, wrestling with real questions about evil, suffering, and where all of it came from. Tonight isn't going to ask you to believe any particular thing about angels or giants. What I want to give you instead is something better for a sleepy night like this one. I want to give you the true, documented history of how this strange old book came to exist, who wrote it and why, what daily life looked like for the people who first told these stories around their own fires, and what the text itself actually says happened in that shadowy stretch of time between the garden and the flood. Where the history is solid ground, I'll tell you plainly it's solid ground. Where we're standing on ancient belief and legend, I'll tell you that too. That's a promise I try to keep every single night we do this together. So let's start where any good long story should start, not with angels descending from the sky just yet. We'll get there slowly, the way you'd want to on a night like this. Let's start with a boy, a goat, and a cave that had been quietly waiting for almost 2,000 years to be found. The cave and the scroll. I want you to imagine the landscape first, because it matters more than people think. The area around the Dead Sea is one of the strangest places on the surface of the earth. It sits over 1,300 feet below sea level, the lowest exposed land anywhere on the planet, and the air there has a heaviness to it, a thick mineral stillness that presses against your skin. The hills are the color of raw clay and old parchment, streaked here and there with a chalky white where the limestone breaks through. Almost nothing grows. In the summer, the heat comes down like a hand pressing flat against the ground, and even in winter the sun sits harsh and pale in a sky that rarely offers a cloud for relief. It is a landscape built for silence. For centuries, almost nobody wanted to live there, except a handful of shepherds moving their flocks between the scattered patches of grazing land, and a scattering of monks and hermits who found something holy in all that emptiness. It was into this landscape, sometime in late 1946 or very early 1947, depending on which telling you trust, that a Bedouin shepherd boy named Mohammed Ed-Dihib went looking for a goat that had wandered off from the rest of his herd. He belonged to the Tamir tribe, people who had grazed animals in these hills for generations, who knew every wadi and outcrop the way you know the layout of your own kitchen in the dark. Losing an animal out there wasn't a small thing. A goat represented food, wool, milk, a portion of a family's whole livelihood. So when this one slipped away from the group near a place called Qumran, close to the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, the boy went after it seriously, scrambling up through loose rock and scrub toward the caves that pocked the cliffside above. Now here is where the story gets a little different depending on who's telling it, and I think that's worth pausing on for a moment, because even a discovery this important, made in living memory, with witnesses still around to ask, comes down to us slightly blurred at the edges. Some versions say he threw a stone into a cave opening hoping to startle the goat out. Other versions say he was simply exploring, the way any bored teenager might poke around an interesting-looking hole in a cliff face. What almost everyone agrees on is that a stone, thrown or dropped, struck something inside that cave that shattered like old pottery, and that sound was strange enough, and interesting enough, that the boy didn't just walk away. Picture him crouched at that opening, maybe 14 or 15 years old, the light behind him fading toward evening, weighing whether it's worth climbing into a dark hole in a cliff in the middle of nowhere. Fear is a reasonable response here. Caves in that region had a reputation, some genuinely dangerous, some simply unnerving in the way any unlit space is unnerving to a young person alone at dusk. According to the most repeated version of the story, he actually left and came back later, maybe the next day, with a cousin or a friend for company, because doing something frightening feels much more manageable when you're not doing it by yourself. That's a very human detail, and I like that it survived in the telling, because it reminds you that history isn't made only by brave, fearless figures. Sometimes it's made by a nervous teenager who needed backup before crawling into the dark. When he finally did climb inside, what he found were tall clay jars, cylindrical, lidded, arranged in rows against the cave walls, coated in the pale dust of centuries. Whoever placed them there had done so with real care. This wasn't rubbish tossed into a hole. This was storage, deliberate and protective, the kind of care you give to something you intend to come back for one day. Inside those jars were scrolls wrapped in linen cloth that had gone stiff and fragile with age, some of leather, some of papyrus, covered edge to edge with lettering in a script the boy could not read. Let's go inside that moment for a second, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. Try to imagine holding something like that for the first time, not knowing its age, not knowing its value, financial or historical. Just a strange bundle of old, cracked material that smells of dust and dry linen, and something faintly like old leather left too long in a closet. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person handling something clearly very old, even if they don't yet understand what it is. Your hands move slower. You lower your voice without deciding to. Something in your body recognizes age even before your mind catches up. What happened next is, frankly, a little painful to hear as a history lover, though completely understandable given the circumstances. The scrolls were not immediately recognized for what they were. They passed through several hands, some scrolls reportedly used, briefly and in ignorance, in ways that damaged them before eventually making their way to antiquities dealers in Bethlehem, and from there slowly into the hands of scholars who could actually read what was written on them. It took time, negotiation, a fair amount of luck, and eventually the involvement of institutions and archaeologists before the full scale of the discovery became clear. And the scale was staggering. Over the following years, further searching of the caves around Qumran, eventually numbering 11 separate caves explored in that area, turned up what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of roughly 900 documents in total, some nearly complete, most existing only as fragments, some no bigger than a fingernail. They dated from as early as the 3rd century before the Common Era up through the 1st century after it, making them, at the time of their discovery, the oldest surviving copies of many biblical and religious texts the Western world had ever laid hands on. I want you to sit with that timeline for a moment, because it's easy to skim past a number like that without really feeling its weight. Before this discovery, the oldest complete copies scholars had of the Hebrew Bible dated from roughly the 10th century of the Common Era, the product of careful, generation after generation of scribal copying. The Qumran scrolls reached back nearly 1,000 years earlier than that. Suddenly historians and religious scholars had something almost unthinkable, a direct window into what these texts looked like in the centuries right around the time many of them believed Jesus of Nazareth was walking through these very hills, and further back still, into the last few centuries before that. Among that enormous trove of fragments, tucked in among copies of Psalms and Isaiah and countless other works, scholars found something that immediately caught their attention. Fragments in Aramaic of a book that Jewish and Christian tradition had known about for a very long time by reputation, but which had essentially vanished from circulation in most of the world. A book attributed to a man named Enoch, described in the book of Genesis in just a few sparse, tantalizing lines. A man who, according to that ancient account, walked so closely with God that he simply didn't die the way everyone else did. He was, in the words of that old text, taken. And this newly rediscovered book claimed to know exactly where he'd been taken to. It claimed to explain what he saw there. And most strikingly, for our purposes tonight, it claimed to explain, in vivid and often unsettling detail, exactly what had gone wrong on the earth in the age just before Noah built his boat. We'll get to all of that. But before we open that book and step into its strange, ancient world, I think it's worth understanding something else first. This book didn't fall out of the sky the way its own angels supposedly did. It was written by real people, living real lives in a specific and fascinating stretch of history. And if we're going to understand what they were trying to say, and why they said it the way they did, we need to go and stand in their sandals for a while first. Let's go inside their world next. The book nobody was supposed to find. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If the Book of Enoch is old enough, important enough, and detailed enough to explain one of the strangest gaps in the entire Bible, why had most of the world never heard of it before those scrolls turned up in a cave? The honest answer is that it hadn't vanished everywhere. It had just vanished from almost everywhere that mattered to the people writing the history books we grew up reading. And that's a story in itself, one we'll come back to later tonight. But first, let's talk about where this book actually came from, because the truth is more interesting and a little more complicated than most retellings let on. Scholars today generally agree that what we call the Book of Enoch isn't really one book at all. It's a collection, 5 originally separate works, written by different hands in different generations, later stitched together into a single volume. Think of it less like a novel and more like an anthology, assembled slowly over roughly 4 centuries. Somewhere between the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 1st century after it. The oldest and, for our purposes tonight, most important section is usually called the Book of the Watchers, and most scholars place its composition somewhere in the 3rd century before the Common Era, which would put its earliest layers older than almost anything else we're going to discuss tonight. Older even than most of what became the New Testament by several hundred years. Now, who actually held the pen? That's harder to answer with certainty, and I want to be honest with you about that uncertainty rather than paper over it. We don't have a name, a household, a single identifiable author signing his work the way a modern writer might. What we have instead is a strong scholarly consensus that these texts emerged from circles of Jewish scribes and teachers living in Judea, likely connected to priestly or scholarly communities, writing under the name of Enoch not to deceive anyone in the way we might think of forgery today, but following a common and accepted literary practice of the era called pseudepigraphy. Writers of this period frequently attributed their work to a revered ancient figure, both as an act of humility, setting their own voice aside in favor of an authoritative one, and as a way of signaling that the wisdom being shared was ancient, trustworthy, even divinely rooted, rather than a personal opinion cooked up that afternoon. It's worth pausing here to notice something. This wasn't unusual or scandalous behavior by the standards of the time. A huge amount of literature from this era, some of which made it into various biblical canons and some of which didn't, was written this way. The line between what we now call fiction, theology, and history was drawn very differently 2,000 years ago than it is drawn today. And I think part of doing honest history is resisting the urge to judge the past by categories it never agreed to use in the first place. So why does the timing matter so much? Why the 3rd century before the Common Era specifically? To answer that, we need to understand what was actually happening to the Jewish people during those centuries, because the Book of Enoch didn't emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from a period of enormous upheaval, one crisis stacked on top of another, and I think you can feel that anxiety humming underneath every page of the text if you know what to listen for. By the time the earliest sections of Enoch were likely being written, the Jewish people had already lived through the trauma of the Babylonian conquest and exile centuries earlier, the destruction of the First Temple in Jerusalem, and decades spent as displaced people in a foreign land before eventually being permitted to return and rebuild. Then came the conquests of Alexander the Great, sweeping through the region in the latter part of the 4th century before the Common Era, folding Judea into a vast Hellenistic world suddenly saturated with Greek language, Greek gods, Greek gymnasiums, and Greek ways of thinking about the universe. After Alexander's death, his empire splintered among his generals, and Judea found itself caught, quite literally, in the middle, first under the control of the Ptolemaic kingdom based in Egypt, and later under the Seleucid kingdom based in Syria, two rival powers who spent generations fighting wars that regularly rolled straight through Jewish territory. This was not a peaceful backdrop for quiet scholarly reflection. This was a world where a Jewish farmer might wake up one season under one set of foreign tax collectors, and the next season under another, where a temple official in Jerusalem had to navigate the shifting favor of kings hundreds of miles away who could, and sometimes did, interfere directly in who held the high priesthood, the most sacred office in Jewish religious life. Eventually, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, this pressure boiled over entirely, when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV attempted to forcibly suppress Jewish religious practice altogether, an act of persecution so severe that it sparked the Maccabean Revolt, an armed rebellion that Jewish communities still commemorate today during the festival of Hanukkah. I'm walking you through all of this political history not to overwhelm you tonight, but because I think it explains something essential about why the Book of Enoch reads the way it does. This is not a calm, settled text written by comfortable people with time on their hands. It's a text saturated with the anxieties of people who had watched violence, corruption, and the abuse of power sweep through their world again and again, who had watched foreign rulers claim godlike authority, who had seen their own religious institutions bent and pressured by outside forces. And so when these writers reach back into the ancient past, into the shadowy centuries before Noah, and imagined a world corrupted by beings who had abandoned their proper place in the divine order, who had seized power and knowledge that wasn't meant for them, and who had filled the earth with violence as a result, they weren't writing pure fantasy detached from their own lives. They were, in a very real sense, writing about their own moment in history, dressed in the clothing of the deep past. This is something worth remembering as we move deeper into the story tonight. Almost every culture, when it reaches back to explain the origins of evil or suffering or chaos in the world, ends up describing its own fears in the process. The ancient Mesopotamians did it. The ancient Greeks did it. And the Jewish scribes writing what became the Book of Enoch did it too, weaving their own centuries' anxieties about corrupted power and violence into a story ostensibly about the earliest, most primeval age of the world. And it worked, in the sense that the book found a genuinely devoted audience. Among the community that preserved many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, generally believed to be a strict, separatist Jewish sect, often identified with the Essenes, fragments of Enoch were remarkably well represented. Scholars have recovered portions of it in Aramaic from multiple different caves at Qumran, suggesting the community kept and likely studied several copies. This tells us something important. Whatever this community believed about the nature of good and evil, about angels and judgment and the coming end of days, the Book of Enoch spoke directly to it. It wasn't an obscure curiosity to them. It was closer to essential reading. The book's influence didn't stop with that one desert community either. Echoes and direct references to Enoch's story show up scattered elsewhere in Jewish literature of the period, and later, strikingly, inside the New Testament itself. The short epistle of Jude, tucked near the very end of the Christian New Testament, actually quotes the Book of Enoch directly, naming Enoch by name and citing a prophecy about divine judgment that comes almost word for word from this older text. For a book that would eventually be excluded from most official biblical canons, that's a remarkable thing to notice. It was clearly circulating, clearly respected, clearly considered meaningful enough that an early Christian writer felt comfortable quoting it as though everyone reading would recognize the reference. So why, then, did it eventually fall out of favor almost everywhere except one corner of the world we'll visit later tonight? The reasons are tangled, and historians still debate the precise mix of theology, politics, and simple historical accident involved. Some early Christian theologians voiced real discomfort with the book's content, particularly its vivid depiction of angelic beings taking human wives and fathering children, a concept some later church authorities found troubling or simply too strange to sit comfortably alongside the rest of Scripture. As the process of formally deciding which books belonged in the Christian and Jewish canons unfolded over the following centuries, different councils and communities in different regions made different calls, and in most of the Mediterranean world, Enoch was quietly left off the list. But not everywhere. And that thread, the one place on earth where this book never stopped being read, copied, and treated as Scripture, is going to matter a great deal later tonight. For now, though, I want to pull back from councils and canons and controversies for a little while, because I think we've earned a slower moment. I want to take you somewhere quieter. I want to show you what an ordinary day actually looked like for the kind of person who might have written or first heard these stories. Because before we step into the strange world before the flood, I think it helps to first understand the very real, very human world these ancient storytellers were sitting in while they imagined it. Let's go inside a home in Judea on an ordinary morning, roughly 2,200 years ago. A morning in Judea. I want you to imagine waking up before the sun. Not because of an alarm, because there wasn't one, not the kind you know. You wake because the roosters somewhere down the hillside have already started, because the first gray light is beginning to seep through the small, high window of a house built from sun-dried mud brick and undressed limestone, and because your body, having gone to sleep not long after dark the night before, simply doesn't need much more rest than that. There was no scrolling through a bright screen the night before to steal an hour of sleep from you. When the sun went down, most work stopped, and most people went to bed early by simple necessity, because oil for a lamp was expensive and darkness was total. Picture the room itself for a moment. If this is a fairly typical rural household in Judea during this period, the house is small by modern standards, often built around a central courtyard shared by an extended family, several related households clustered together. Grandparents and grown children and their own children all living within shouting distance of one another. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth, sometimes covered with woven mats. The walls are thick, which matters more than you'd think, because thick stone and mud brick walls keep a house relatively cool during the brutal heat of midday and relatively warm once the desert chill sets in after dark. There is very little furniture in the way we'd recognize it. A few low platforms or benches built along the walls, sometimes doubling as sleeping areas, storage niches built directly into the walls themselves, and large ceramic jars, tall as your knee or higher, standing in a corner, holding the household's grain, its oil, its water. The smell of the place would hit you first if you could somehow step inside. Wood smoke first and constantly, because a fire needs tending nearly every day for cooking. The mineral, slightly damp smell of packed earth. Somewhere underneath it, the animal smell of livestock, because in many of these households, a family's goats or sheep might be brought into an enclosed part of the courtyard at night, both for warmth in the colder months and for protection from predators and thieves. If you've never lived closely alongside animals like that, it's worth imagining for a second. The particular sound of hooves shifting on packed earth just outside your sleeping area. The low sounds animals make settling in for the night. Sounds that would have been as unremarkable and comforting to a child of this era as the hum of a refrigerator is to a child today. Let's follow a woman of the household through her morning, because so much of daily survival in this period rested on labor that history books tend to skip right past. Before the sun is properly up, she is already at the millstone, a pair of flat, heavy stones, one set atop the other, grinding grain into flour for that day's bread. This isn't a quick task. It's repetitive, physical, often done kneeling or crouched, grinding handful after handful of wheat or barley between the stones, and it would typically take an hour or more just to produce enough flour for a single day's meals for a family. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains from this general period and region have actually found telltale signs of this labor, where patterns on the bones of women's knees, toes, and lower backs, quiet physical evidence of thousands of hours spent kneeling at the grindstone across a lifetime. While she works the grain, someone else in the household, likely a child old enough to be trusted with the task, but still young, 7 or 8 years old perhaps, has already gone to fetch water for the day. If this household is fortunate enough to live near a spring or a well, this might be a short walk. If not, it could mean a genuine journey down a hillside path and back up again, a heavy clay jar balanced against the hip or carried on the head, a skill that took real practice and real core strength to manage without spilling half of it on the return trip. Water was not a thing you took for granted in this landscape. In much of Judea, the difference between a good year and a catastrophic one often came down entirely to whether the rains had come on time and in sufficient quantity, because there was no reliable alternative. Once the flour is ground, the bread gets made, usually simple flatbread, cooked quickly against the hot inner wall of a domed clay oven, or sometimes directly on a heated stone or griddle set over the coals. There's no yeast in the way you'd think of it today. No packet from a store. Bread was often leavened when it was leavened at all, using a bit of fermented dough saved from the previous batch. A living culture passed along day after day, sometimes for years within a single household. Breakfast, such as it was, tended to be simple. Bread, perhaps dipped in olive oil, perhaps alongside a handful of olives themselves, or a bit of cheese made from goat's or sheep's milk. Soft and sharp and nothing at all like the mild yellow blocks most of us picture today. Outside, as the light strengthens, the men and older boys of the household are already moving out toward the fields and terraces, because agriculture in this hilly, often rocky landscape demanded an enormous amount of infrastructure just to make farming possible at all. Much of the land around Jerusalem and throughout the Judean hills isn't flat, open farmland the way we might picture from other parts of the ancient world. It's steep, terraced hillside and those terraces, low stone retaining walls built by hand, generation after generation, holding back soil that would otherwise wash straight down the slope during the winter rains, represent an almost unimaginable amount of accumulated labor. Families maintained the same terraces their grandparents had built, and their great-grandparents before them, a physical inheritance of stone and soil passed down alongside whatever land rights and family stories came with it. On these terraces grew the trio of crops that defined life across this entire region. For thousands of years, grain, olives, and grapes, wheat and barley for bread and porridge. Olive trees, slow-growing and almost absurdly long-lived, some producing fruit for centuries, pressed for oil that served as food, fuel for lamps, and even a kind of early cosmetic and medicine, rubbed into skin and hair. And grapevines, trained along low stone walls or simple wooden frames, their fruit eaten fresh in season but mostly pressed and fermented into wine, which in this period and place functioned less as an occasional indulgence and more as a basic dietary staple, often mixed with water and drunk by adults, and in diluted form, sometimes even children, partly because it was frequently safer than the local water supply on its own. I want you to pause here for a moment and just feel the difference between that life and the one most of us listening to this tonight actually live. Nearly every single calorie a family consumed in a day represented direct, visible, physical labor by someone in that household or their close neighbors. There was no walking to a refrigerator. There was no quick trip to a store. Food was the product of a full agricultural calendar stretching across an entire year, the autumn plowing and sowing, the anxious watching of the winter skies for rain, the spring growth, the early summer harvest of grain, the late summer pressing of olives and grapes. A bad season, a poor rainfall year, an invading army trampling through at exactly the wrong moment could mean real hunger, not an inconvenience but a genuine threat to survival. And it's precisely against this backdrop, this world of hard physical labor, of communities utterly dependent on rainfall and soil, and the fragile predictability of the seasons, that we need to understand the anxieties baked into a text like the Book of Enoch. When these ancient writers imagined a world before the flood corrupted by violence, by stolen knowledge, by beings who had abandoned their proper place and thrown the natural order into chaos, they were writing from inside a world where the natural order genuinely felt fragile, where rain either came or didn't, where peace either held or didn't, where a family's entire yearly survival rested on forces largely outside their control. Let's sit with that feeling for just another moment before we move forward, because I think it's the emotional key that unlocks everything else we're about to explore tonight. Imagine living in a world with no meteorologists, no crop insurance, no grocery store shelves restocked overnight from somewhere else entirely. Imagine a world where the difference between abundance and starvation felt, quite reasonably, like it might depend on whether the proper order of things, heaven staying heaven, earth staying earth, was somehow being respected or violated. In that kind of world, a story about angels leaving their assigned place, about knowledge and power falling into the wrong hands, about the earth itself becoming so corrupted with violence that it cried out for judgment, wasn't abstract theology. It was, in its own strange way, an explanation for exactly the kind of instability these people lived with every single day of their lives. Now that we've stood inside that world for a while, felt the wood smoke and the ground grain and the terraced hillsides beneath tired feet, I think we're finally ready to open the old book itself. Let's go inside the story the way its earliest readers would have heard it, gathered close, probably by firelight, as someone who could read aloud slowly worked through what Enoch claimed to have seen. A world still new. Before we can talk about what went wrong, I think we need to talk about what the world was supposed to be, at least according to the people telling this story. In the imagination of ancient Judea, the age before the flood wasn't simply the distant past the way we might think of, say, the Bronze Age or the time of the pharaohs. It was something closer to a different kind of world altogether, a world still young, still close to its own creation, where the line separating heaven from earth was thinner than it would ever be again. This is a detail that's easy to skim past, but I think it matters enormously for understanding the emotional texture of the story. In many ancient traditions, not just this one, the deep past is imagined as a time when gods, angels, and divine beings walked much closer to human affairs than they do in the writer's own present. The very fact that something could go wrong up there, close enough to affect life down here, only makes sense in a world imagined that way. Genesis itself, in the book that most people are at least somewhat familiar with, gives us only the barest sketch of this period, a handful of verses tucked into its 6th chapter, right before the story of Noah begins. It's worth actually hearing what those few sparse lines say, because the Book of Enoch essentially exists to answer the questions those verses leave hanging in the air. Genesis tells us that as humanity increased upon the face of the earth, certain beings referred to as sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and took wives for themselves from among them, choosing whichever ones pleased them. It tells us that in those days there were giants upon the earth, and also afterward, when these sons of God came in to the daughters of men and had children by them, and that these children became mighty men, men of renown from ancient times. And then, almost immediately after, we're told that the wickedness of humanity had become so great, and every inclination of the human heart so relentlessly evil, that a decision was made to wipe the slate clean entirely. That's it. That's the whole account in Genesis. A handful of verses, deeply strange even on a careful reading, raising far more questions than they answer. Who exactly were these sons of God? What did it mean for divine beings to take human wives? Why would that act specifically be connected, in the very next breath, to the world becoming so wicked that judgment became necessary? Ancient readers, just like modern ones, clearly found this passage tantalizing and incomplete. And the Book of Enoch, whatever else we want to say about it, exists largely as an attempt to fill in that gap, to answer the questions Genesis raises but never resolves. According to the framework the Book of Enoch builds, humanity in these earliest generations after Adam had indeed multiplied and spread across the earth, much as Genesis describes. And watching all of this unfold from their proper place were beings the text calls watchers, a class of heavenly beings, angels in the broadest sense, whose assigned role, according to this tradition, was precisely what the name suggests. They watched. They observed the workings of the world from their appointed station, without interfering directly in human affairs. Think of them less as the winged, gentle messenger angels that later Christian art would make so familiar, and more as a kind of celestial order of guardians and observers, holy by virtue of their obedience to their assigned place in the cosmic structure. And that idea, obedience to one's assigned place, is genuinely the emotional and theological center of everything that follows in this story. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to get swept up in the more dramatic elements of what's coming and miss the actual point the ancient author seems to be making. The Book of Enoch isn't primarily interested in angels and giants as spectacle. It's interested in a much older, much more universal human anxiety, the fear of what happens when those who hold power, position, or knowledge decide their assigned boundaries no longer apply to them. I want you to imagine for a moment how this story might have sounded to its earliest audience, sitting in a small mud-brick home somewhere in the Judean hills, listening by the light of a single oil lamp while someone read these words aloud from a scroll slowly, because reading aloud was often the only way most people in this period ever encountered a written text at all. Literacy was rare. Scrolls were expensive, painstakingly copied by hand, letter by letter, on material that itself took real skill and labor to produce. A single household might never own a scroll of their own in an entire lifetime. Instead, stories like this one traveled through communal listening, in synagogues, in courtyards, in the kind of gathering where an elder or a scribe who could read would share the text aloud to a room of people leaning in close, children included, catching every word. Picture that scene for a moment, because I think it's worth lingering in. The last light fading outside, a single lamp, its small flame throwing long, moving shadows against a mud-brick wall. A dozen or so people, extended family and maybe a few neighbors, seated on the floor or on low benches, some with children drowsing against a shoulder, all quiet, all listening, because in a world without books of your own, without any other form of evening entertainment beyond conversation and story, a chance to hear an old, mysterious tale like this one was genuinely precious. There was no separating the pleasure of the story from its religious and moral weight. It was, all at once, entertainment, theology, and a way of making sense of why the world contained so much suffering. And into that hushed, listening room, the story begins its slow turn toward the strange and troubling event at its heart. According to the Book of Enoch, it happened during the days of a man named Jared, several generations after Adam according to the ancient genealogies, when a group of these watchers, angels who were meant only to observe, looked down at the daughters of men and found themselves overcome with desire. This wasn't a small handful of rebellious spirits either. The text names a leader among them, called Shemiheza in most versions of the story, and it lists roughly 200 watchers who conspired together to descend from their proper place and take human wives for themselves. There's a small detail here that I think reveals a great deal about how seriously the ancient author took the idea of consequence, of accountability, and I want to slow down and share it with you, because it's often skipped over in quicker retellings. According to the text, Shemiheza, the leader among these watchers, was afraid. Not eager, not simply lustful and reckless, but afraid, specifically afraid that if he descended alone, if he alone broke this ancient boundary and was later punished for it, he would bear the guilt entirely by himself. So he gathered the others together and proposed something closer to a pact, a binding oath, in which each of the roughly 200 watchers swore together, bound themselves with mutual curses, agreeing to share the responsibility and the risk, collectively. I find that detail genuinely fascinating and worth pausing on again, because it doesn't read like a story about simple, uncomplicated evil. It reads like a story about the specific psychology of shared guilt, about how large groups of people, or in this case, celestial beings, can talk themselves into crossing a line together that any one of them might have hesitated to cross alone. It's the ancient equivalent of a story we still tell each other constantly today, in different clothing, about how bad decisions rarely happen in total isolation. They happen in groups, through mutual encouragement, through the strange comfort of shared responsibility, making an individual choice feel smaller, less personal, easier to make. According to the text, this oath and this conspiracy took place on the summit of a real, physical mountain, one you could still travel to and stand upon today if you wished. Mount Hermon, a genuinely striking peak rising along the modern border area shared by Lebanon, Syria, and the Golan Heights, snow-capped for much of the year, visible from a remarkable distance across the surrounding lowlands. Even today, this mountain holds a certain haunted reputation in some local traditions, layered generation upon generation with stories, legends, and, frankly, a fair amount of later folklore added long after the Book of Enoch itself was written. But the choice of a real, identifiable, physically imposing landmark for this pivotal moment in the story is worth noticing. It grounds an otherwise cosmic, heavenly drama in a landscape the original audience could picture clearly, a mountain many of them may have actually seen with their own eyes, or at least heard described by traders and travelers who had passed near it. I want you to imagine standing at the base of a mountain like that, craning your neck upward toward a peak wrapped in cloud and snow, and being told that somewhere up there, in the thin, cold air near the summit, 200 divine beings once stood together and swore an oath that would unravel the fabric of the world below. There's something about grounding a myth in real, physical geography that makes it land differently than a story set in some vague, unspecified elsewhere. This mountain existed. People could travel toward it. And according to this old story, something genuinely world-altering had happened at its summit, long, long before any living person's grandparents had been born. So the oath is sworn, the pact is made, and in the next part of the story, the watchers descend from that snow-covered peak, leaving their proper place behind entirely, and enter directly into the daily, ordinary human world we spent our last chapter walking through together. Let's follow them down. The Watchers on the Mountain. There's a particular kind of story that appears across an enormous number of ancient cultures, in versions so varied, and yet so structurally similar that scholars have long puzzled over exactly why humanity keeps returning to it. It's the story of a boundary between the divine world and the human world, a boundary that's supposed to hold, and doesn't. The Greeks told a version of it through the story of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and handing it to humanity, an act of transgression that reshaped the world below while bringing terrible consequence upon the one who did it. Mesopotamian traditions carried their own versions of divine beings interfering directly and disastrously in human affairs. And here, in this Judean telling, we get the Watchers, angels abandoning their assigned station and descending into the world of men. According to the Book of Enoch, once that oath was sworn at the summit of Mount Hermon, the Watchers descended and did exactly what the brief, cryptic verses in Genesis had hinted at. They took human women as wives. Not through some abstract, symbolic union, but described in the text in genuinely physical, human terms, marriage and children, ordinary domestic life reshaped by the presence of these fallen, powerful beings suddenly living among mortal women, and eventually raising families with them. I want to pause here and be careful with you. The way I try to be careful every night we do this together. Because there's a real difference between describing what an ancient text says and endorsing or asserting that it happened as literal historical fact. What we're doing tonight is walking through ancient belief, ancient storytelling, ancient theology, the way a careful historian would walk you through Greek mythology or Norse mythology, not because we're asking you to believe these events occurred exactly as described, but because understanding what people genuinely believed, and why, tells us something true and valuable about the world they lived in and the fears that shaped them. With that said, let's continue following the story as its ancient audience would have heard it. According to the text, the unions between these watchers and human women produced offspring unlike anything the world had seen before, beings the text calls Nephilim, a Hebrew term whose precise meaning scholars still debate, though it's often connected to a root suggesting something fallen or cast down. These offspring are described as giants, enormous in size and appetite, and this is where the story shifts from strange and unsettling into something the text frames as genuinely catastrophic for the world. Picture, if you will, the description the text offers, because it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. These giant offspring, according to the Book of Enoch, grew to consume everything available to them, and it wasn't enough. The text describes them devouring the labor of ordinary people, the crops so carefully tended on those terraced hillsides we walked through together earlier, the herds families had raised across generations, until there was nothing left to sustain them, and their hunger, according to the story, turned toward humanity itself. It's a deeply unsettling image, and I think intentionally so. This isn't meant to be a comfortable bedtime tale in the way its original audience experienced it. It was meant to convey, in the starkest possible terms, what happens when unchecked, unnatural power is loosed upon an ordinary, vulnerable world. I think it's worth remembering, again, the audience we discussed in our last chapter. People whose entire survival depended on the fragile success of a single growing season, on rainfall arriving at the right moment, on terraced hillsides yielding enough grain to last through a long winter. A story about giant, insatiable beings devouring an entire community's food supply and labor wasn't abstract horror to that audience. It was, in a heightened mythologized form, a description of the single greatest fear governing their entire daily existence, the fear of scarcity, of a world where the resources you depended on for survival were suddenly, catastrophically, not enough. But the Book of Enoch doesn't stop at describing physical devastation and hunger. It layers on top of that a second kind of corruption, one that I think the ancient author considered even more dangerous, and it's here that the story becomes, in a strange way, about something closer to what we might today call technology, or knowledge, or the ethics of innovation. Let's slow down and walk through it carefully, because I think it's one of the most genuinely fascinating parts of this entire ancient text. The things they taught. If you've been listening carefully, you might have noticed that the Book of Enoch doesn't blame the corruption of the pre-flood world solely on the physical violence of the giants. There's a second thread running through the story, quieter, but in some ways more unsettling to the original audience, and it concerns knowledge itself, and the question of what happens when powerful secrets fall into hands not ready to hold them responsibly. According to the text, the Watchers didn't just take human wives and father monstrous children. They also began teaching humanity things it had never known before, skills and knowledge that, in the story's telling, didn't belong to the human world yet, and whose sudden, ungoverned arrival helped tip an already fragile situation into full catastrophe. The text names several of these watchers individually and attributes specific forms of forbidden knowledge to each of them. And I think walking through a few of these examples slowly is genuinely worthwhile, because they reveal something quite sophisticated about what this ancient author actually feared. One watcher, named Azazel in the text, a figure who becomes especially prominent as the story continues, is credited with teaching humanity the working of metal, specifically the forging of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, the full apparatus of organized warfare. Before this, the text implies, human conflict existed on a smaller, more limited scale, presumably fought with whatever crude tools were already at hand. Azazel's teaching, according to the story, changed the very nature of violence itself, giving it new tools, new lethality, new reach. Alongside this, he's also credited with teaching people the working of precious metals into ornaments, and in a detail that I think is quietly brilliant on the part of the ancient author, the making of cosmetics, the art of coloring the eyelids, adorning the face, beautifying the body in ways the text frames as connected to vanity, deception, and the corruption of natural, honest appearance. I want you to sit with the pairing of those two things for a moment, weapons and cosmetics, because at first glance they seem to belong to entirely different categories of concern. But I think the ancient author is making a genuinely thoughtful point here, one that still resonates. Both represent a kind of artificial enhancement of the human body and human capability, tools that let a person appear, or become, more than what they naturally were. A sword lets an ordinary person kill with far more efficiency and reach than their own two hands would allow. Cosmetics let a person's appearance promise something that might not reflect the truth underneath. In both cases, the text seems to be expressing anxiety about a world where surfaces and capabilities no longer honestly reflect the natural, given order of things, where artifice begins to outpace and obscure what's real. Other watchers, according to the text, taught different forms of knowledge. One is credited with teaching people the cutting of roots and the properties of plants, an early form of what we might call herbalism or pharmacology, knowledge that carried real danger alongside real potential benefit, since the same plant that might heal could, in different hands or different doses, just as easily poison. Others are credited with teaching the observation of the stars and the signs of the heavens, an early form of astrology, the reading of omens, and, more broadly, various forms of enchantment and sorcery. Still another is associated with teaching people how to observe the moon in order to calculate time, a detail that, interestingly, ties this ancient story of forbidden knowledge to something as practical and universal as the human effort to measure and structure time itself. What strikes me most, thinking about this list as a whole, is how deliberately varied it is. This isn't simply a story about weapons corrupting the world, though that's clearly part of it. It's a much broader meditation on knowledge itself, on the specific danger of powerful information or capability arriving suddenly, without the slow, careful cultural and moral development that might otherwise accompany it. Metalworking, cosmetics, herbal medicine, astrology, calendar keeping, all genuinely useful skills in their own right, all things human societies eventually developed and integrated into ordinary, functional life. The Book of Enoch's anxiety isn't really that this knowledge exists. It's that it arrived too fast, handed down whole and complete from beings who had no business sharing it, without the gradual, hard-won process of learning how to use it wisely. I think that's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's an anxiety that honestly hasn't gone anywhere in the roughly 22 centuries since these words were first written down. Every generation seems to develop its own version of this exact worry, the fear that some new capability, some new tool, some new form of power has arrived faster than the accompanying wisdom needed to handle it responsibly. The ancient scribe writing about Azazel teaching humanity to forge iron swords was grappling with essentially the same underlying fear that shows up again and again across history. Whenever a society encounters a genuinely transformative new technology, the details change. The underlying human anxiety, watching power outrun wisdom, does not. There's a particularly vivid moment in the text worth mentioning here, because it captures something the rest of the story sometimes loses in its focus on giants and violence. According to the Book of Enoch, humanity's cry eventually rises all the way up to heaven itself, a description of ordinary people, overwhelmed by the violence and corruption now filling the earth, crying out for help, their voices ascending past the very gates the watchers themselves had once occupied. 4 archangels, named Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and one more depending on the version of the text you're reading, hear this cry and bring it before God directly, describing in detail the devastation the watchers and their offspring have caused below. I find this moment genuinely moving, honestly, even removed from any question of belief. It's a story, at its core, about ordinary people caught in the middle of a catastrophe they didn't create and couldn't control, a corruption introduced from above, by beings with far more power than they had, and their only recourse, in the story's own telling, is simply to cry out and hope that cry is heard by someone capable of doing something about it. That's a deeply, timelessly human position to be in, regardless of what century you're living through. It's the position of anyone who has ever watched forces far larger than themselves reshape their world in ways they had no say in. And it's here, with that cry rising toward heaven, that I want to slow down again and step outside the Book of Enoch itself for just a little while, because this idea, a world grown so violent and corrupt that heaven itself decides the only remedy is a flood to wash it clean, wasn't unique to this one Jewish text, or even to the biblical tradition more broadly. It was, remarkably, an idea that shows up in strikingly similar form in cultures across the entire ancient Near East, preserved on clay tablets that had been buried and forgotten for thousands of years before a very particular, very true story brought them back into the light. The tablet in the rubble. In the year 1872, in a quiet room inside the British Museum in London, a man named George Smith was doing something that, on its face, sounds almost unbearably tedious. He was going through fragments, thousands of small, broken pieces of clay tablet, covered in the dense, wedge-shaped script called cuneiform, that had been excavated years earlier from the ruins of an ancient library in what is now northern Iraq, near the modern city of Mosul. That library had once belonged to Ashurbanipal, king of the Assyrian Empire in the 7th century before the Common Era, a genuinely remarkable collection of tens of thousands of clay tablets covering history, religion, science, and literature, assembled deliberately as one of the ancient world's great centers of accumulated knowledge, before the city itself, Nineveh, fell to invading armies, and the library collapsed into the rubble where it would lie buried and forgotten for roughly 2,500 years. George Smith had no formal university education. He'd started his working life as an apprentice engraver, a trade that, almost by accident, gave him an unusually keen eye for fine detail and pattern recognition, skills that turned out to translate remarkably well into the painstaking work of deciphering ancient scripts. He'd essentially taught himself the difficult, still relatively new science of reading cuneiform, spending his lunch breaks and free hours at the British Museum poring over tablets, until his obvious talent eventually earned him a formal position working directly with the museum's growing collection. On this particular day, sorting through fragments recovered from that buried Assyrian library, Smith began piecing together a tablet that told a story he recognized immediately, with a jolt that, by his own later account and the account of colleagues who witnessed it, left him almost unable to contain himself. The tablet described a great flood, sent to destroy a corrupt and overpopulated humanity, survived by a single man who was warned in advance, who built a boat, loaded it with his family and with animals of every kind, and who, after the waters receded, sent out birds to search for dry land. It was, in its broad shape, unmistakably, strikingly similar to the flood story most of his Victorian British audience already knew intimately from the Bible. According to the accounts of his colleagues and Smith's own later writing, when the full weight of what he was reading landed on him, he reportedly leapt up from his desk in a state of genuine excitement, and, in a detail that has become one of the most delightful, true anecdotes in the entire history of archaeology, began taking off his clothes as he paced rapidly around the room, apparently in a fit of overwhelmed astonishment. Whatever the precise, colorful truth of that particular detail, what's certain and thoroughly documented is that Smith had just become the first person in roughly 2,500 years to read what we now call the Mesopotamian flood story, later understood as part of a larger work called the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest substantial pieces of literature ever recovered by human hands. I want you to sit with the magnitude of that moment for a second, because I think it's genuinely one of the great true stories in the history of discovery. A self-taught engraver, working through broken fragments of clay in a museum room in London, becomes the first person in over 2 millennia to read a story about a catastrophic flood that predates the biblical account of Noah by well over 1,000 years. A story that had been sitting silent and forgotten under the rubble of a fallen empire the entire time. The Mesopotamian flood story Smith uncovered, and the related, even older Sumerian and Akkadian version scholars have pieced together in the years since, from texts known by names like the Atrahasis epic and the story of Ziusudra, follow a structure that will sound remarkably familiar. In these accounts, the gods, troubled by the overwhelming noise, chaos, or wickedness of an ever-multiplying humanity, decide to send a devastating flood to wipe the world clean. One man, warned in advance, usually by a sympathetic god who defies the wider divine council to save him, is instructed to build a large vessel to bring aboard his family and representative animals, and to survive the deluge that follows. Afterward, birds are sent out to search for land. A sacrifice is offered once dry ground is found, and the surviving god or gods, moved by that offering, essentially agree never to attempt something so destructive again. I share all of this with you not to suggest that one of these traditions simply copied the other in any simple, direct sense, because the relationship between them is a great deal more complicated and interesting than that, and scholars have debated the precise nature of that relationship for well over a century now, ever since Smith's discovery first made the comparison possible. What I think is genuinely worth sitting with, on a quiet night like this one, is something a little different. Across an enormous ancient stretch of the Near East, in cultures separated by language, religion, and often outright hostility toward one another, we find echoes of the exact same fundamental fear. A world grown too violent, too corrupted, too far removed from its proper order, met with a catastrophic, cleansing flood as the only remedy severe enough to fit the crime. This is, I think, one of the quiet, genuine wonders of studying ancient history closely. You start to notice that certain fears, certain stories, certain shapes of meaning-making appear again and again across civilizations that never had any direct contact with one another, or whose contact, where it did exist, doesn't fully explain the depth and consistency of the parallel. It suggests something worth sitting with as you drift toward sleep tonight, that this particular fear, the fear of a world becoming so violent, so corrupted, so far removed from whatever its intended order was supposed to be, that it deserves and perhaps requires a kind of total cleansing reset, is an old, old fear, one that seems to live somewhere close to the core of how ancient people everywhere tried to make sense of suffering, violence, and the fragile, precious stability of the world they depended on for their next meal. With that wider, ancient context now sitting alongside our story, let's return to the Book of Enoch itself, and to the world it describes filling up, generation after generation, with exactly the kind of violence these flood traditions across the ancient world all seem to agree eventually demands a reckoning. Giants in the land. Let's go back now to the world the Book of Enoch describes, and let's try to imagine it the way its original audience would have, not as an abstract theological concept, but as a lived, physical reality, a village, a household, an ordinary family trying to get through an increasingly frightening world. Imagine, for a moment, a small settlement somewhere in the hill country, not unlike the households we visited a few chapters ago, except now imagine that same daily rhythm, grinding grain before dawn, tending terraced fields, walking to the well for water, slowly warping under a growing, ambient sense of dread. According to the story the Book of Enoch tells, this isn't a world where danger arrives suddenly and dramatically in a single moment. It's a world where the ordinary rhythms of life, the same rhythms we spent real time understanding earlier tonight, are being slowly, steadily eroded by a corruption that keeps growing worse with each passing season. The text describes the offspring of the Watchers, these giant Nephilim, consuming the labor of ordinary people, and I think it's worth imagining what that would actually feel like from the ground, rather than from the sweeping, cosmic perspective the text sometimes adopts. Imagine a season's harvest, the product of months of backbreaking labor on those terraced hillsides we discussed, the grain carefully threshed and stored, the olives pressed, the grapes fermented, all of it representing not just food but survival itself for the coming winter. And imagine watching that entire harvest disappear, consumed by beings who took whatever they wanted with no thought of exchange, no respect for the labor behind it, no fear of consequence. That's not simply a story about monsters. That's a story about the specific, visceral terror of powerlessness, of watching the fruits of your own survival taken by something you have absolutely no ability to resist. And when the text tells us that the giants, having exhausted what humanity could provide, eventually turned to violence against people themselves, and even, in the starkest and most disturbing detail the text offers, against the animals of the earth, drinking their blood, I think we're meant to understand this as the final, complete collapse of every boundary that had once made the world livable. The boundary between heaven and earth, already broken by the Watcher's original descent. The boundary between human and monstrous, broken by the very existence of the Nephilim. And now, finally, the boundary between predator and prey, between what could be safely trusted and what could not, collapsing entirely as well. This connects directly, I think, to one of the most quietly devastating phrases in the actual biblical account in Genesis, the phrase describing the earth as filled with violence in the days just before the flood. It's a short phrase, easy to read past quickly, but I want you to sit with it for a moment the way the ancient audience likely did. Filled. Not scattered here and there, not an occasional outbreak in some distant place, but filled, saturated completely, violence as the defining texture of daily existence rather than a rare and shocking interruption to it. I want you to imagine, for a moment, what it would do to a community, to a family, to a household not unlike the one we visited earlier, to live inside a world like that for an extended stretch of time. Imagine the particular exhaustion of constant vigilance, the way fear itself becomes a kind of background hum you eventually stop fully noticing, even as it quietly reshapes every decision you make. Do you send the children out to the far terrace alone anymore, or does someone have to go with them now? Do you dare travel to the distant well, or only the closer one, even though its water is worse? Do you still let the animals graze in the usual pasture, or has that pasture become somewhere you no longer trust? This is, I think, part of what makes the Book of Enoch such a genuinely powerful piece of ancient storytelling, whatever your own beliefs about angels or giants might be. It understands something true and enduring about human psychology, the way that violence, once it becomes commonplace enough, doesn't just harm the people directly touched by it. It reshapes the entire texture of daily life for everyone living within reach of it, turning ordinary tasks, fetching water, tending a field, letting a child play outside, into small, constant calculations of risk. The story does offer, eventually, a kind of resolution to this spiraling horror, though I want to be careful here, because it's worth understanding exactly what shape that resolution takes and what it doesn't promise. According to the text, it is not the giants themselves, nor the corrupted watchers, who ultimately bring an end to this reign of violence through some climactic battle or dramatic human victory. The resolution comes from somewhere else entirely, from the same place the original cry for help had been directed, up above, beyond the reach of ordinary human agency altogether. Let's take a slower detour now, before we get to that judgment, because there's another thread in this story that I think deserves real attention on a quiet night like this one. A thread that moves away from violence and corruption entirely, and takes us instead on an extraordinary journey through the heavens themselves, guided by the one human figure at the center of this entire ancient text. Let's talk, finally, about Enoch himself. The scribe who walked with heaven. Everything we've discussed so far tonight, the watchers, the oath at Mount Hermon, the giants, the forbidden knowledge, the violence filling the earth, comes to us filtered through the perspective of a single figure, the man this entire collection of texts is named after. And I think it's worth taking some real time now to understand who Enoch actually was, according to this tradition, because his role in the story is genuinely unusual and reveals something important about what these ancient writers valued most. In the book of Genesis, Enoch receives what might be the shortest, strangest biography of any figure in the entire text. He appears in a genealogical list, a chain of names and lifespans stretching from Adam down toward Noah, most of them summarized in nearly identical language. So many years lived, so many children fathered, so many years lived after that, and then died. Enoch's entry breaks this pattern entirely. The text tells us that Enoch walked with God, a phrase used for essentially no one else in this genealogy, and that after living 365 years, a suspiciously precise number matching the days in a solar year. He simply wasn't there anymore because God took him. No death is recorded, no burial, just an abrupt, mysterious disappearance from the ordinary chain of birth and death that structures everyone else's entry on that list. I think it's worth imagining how strange and tantalizing that must have felt to ancient readers encountering it. In a genealogy otherwise built entirely around the grim, repetitive rhythm of birth and death, here's one figure who simply steps sideways out of that pattern altogether, taken somewhere else instead, with no further explanation offered. It's the kind of narrative gap that practically begs an audience to imagine what might have happened next, and the writers who eventually produced the Book of Enoch took up exactly that invitation, imagining across their 5 interwoven texts an extraordinarily detailed account of where Enoch went, what he saw there, and what he brought back. According to this tradition, Enoch's disappearance wasn't simply an ending. It was a beginning, the start of an extraordinary series of journeys through the heavens themselves, guided by angels, shown the inner workings of the cosmos in a level of detail that goes far beyond anything else in ancient Jewish literature of this period. In one section of the text, often called the astronomical book, and generally considered among the oldest material in the entire collection, Enoch is shown the precise movements of the sun, moon, and stars, guided by an angel named Uriel, who walks him through an elaborate calendar system governing the heavens, month by month, gate by gate, describing which celestial gates the sun and moon pass through across the year. I want to pause here and highlight something genuinely remarkable about this section, something that often gets lost when people focus only on the more dramatic Watcher's narrative. This part of the text represents a serious, careful attempt at astronomical and calendrical description, reflecting real observational interest in the movements of the heavens, and real anxiety, consistent with what we discussed earlier tonight, about maintaining an accurate, properly ordered calendar. Remember, this was a world where an entire agricultural year, and therefore an entire community's survival, depended on knowing precisely when to plow, when to sow, when to expect rain, when to harvest. A miscalculated calendar wasn't a minor inconvenience in this world. It could mean planting at the wrong moment, missing the narrow window of seasonal rain, watching an entire year's harvest fail as a direct result. Enoch's journey through the heavens, learning the precise, correct movements of sun and moon directly from an angel, functions in part as a kind of divine guarantee that the calendar itself, the very structure by which an agricultural society organized its entire survival, rested on trustworthy, heaven-verified foundations. In other sections of the text, Enoch's journey grows even more vivid and strange. He describes traveling to the very edges of the earth, guided by angels through landscapes that blend recognizable geography with clearly symbolic, visionary elements, mountains of fire, storehouses where the winds themselves are kept, a great abyss reserved for fallen stars, a garden containing a tree whose fruit no human is yet permitted to taste. In one particularly striking passage, he's brought before the throne of God itself, described in language of overwhelming, almost unbearable brilliance, crystal and fire, and a radiance so intense that even the angels surrounding it are said to be unable to look directly upon it. Enoch, a mortal man, is somehow brought into this presence, trembling, according to the text, with a fear so total that his very bones seem to dissolve within him. I want you to imagine, for just a moment, what it must have meant to the original audience of this text to hear a mortal man, someone from their own ancient genealogy, someone descended, as they understood it, from the very first human beings, described as standing directly before that kind of overwhelming divine presence and surviving the encounter. In a world where the gap between heaven and earth felt, as we discussed, thin and fragile and dangerous, where watchers had crossed that boundary in one direction with catastrophic consequences, here was a story of a human being crossing it in the other direction, not through transgression, but through obedience, through the simple, quiet phrase from Genesis, walking with God, taken to its most extraordinary possible extreme. And Enoch's role in the story isn't purely that of an awed observer, either. According to the text, he becomes something closer to an advocate, even a kind of reluctant intermediary, when the fallen watchers themselves, terrified of the judgment they now know is coming, approach him and beg him to carry a petition on their behalf, to intercede with heaven and ask for mercy, or at least for some reduction of the punishment they now understand is inevitable. Enoch agrees to try. He writes out their petition, and in a passage with a genuinely striking, almost dreamlike quality, describes falling asleep while composing it, and experiencing a vision in which he's shown in advance exactly how that petition will be received. It is not received well. Enoch is shown, in his vision, that the judgment against the watchers has already been decided, that their plea will not be granted, and it falls to him, this ordinary human scribe elevated to an extraordinary role he seems to have never sought out for himself, to deliver that devastating news back to the very beings who had once held power over the natural order of the world, and who now find themselves utterly powerless before a judgment they cannot appeal. I find this moment, honestly, one of the most quietly poignant in the entire text, and worth sitting with for a moment before we move toward the judgment itself. Here is a human being, from a species the watchers themselves had once looked down upon with desire, and in some sense, a kind of contempt for its assigned, lesser place in the created order, now standing as the one figure capable of moving between both worlds, trusted with a message neither side particularly wants to hear, and delivering it anyway, because that is simply what he has been asked, and in this story's own understanding, called by God to do. Let's follow Enoch now as he carries that message, and let's watch together as the judgment finally arrives. The sentence passed in silence. There's something worth noticing about how the Book of Enoch actually structures its judgment scene, because it isn't staged as a battle or a dramatic confrontation, or anything resembling the kind of climactic action sequence a modern storyteller might reach for instinctively. It's staged instead as a series of quiet, deliberate instructions, God speaking directly to specific archangels, assigning each of them a precise task in restoring order to a world that had fallen so completely out of balance. According to the text, the archangel Raphael is given the task of dealing directly with Azazel, the watcher we discussed earlier, credited with teaching humanity the forging of weapons and the making of cosmetics. Raphael is instructed to bind Azazel hand and foot, and to cast him into darkness, specifically into a desert place, and there, according to the text, to cover him with rough and jagged rocks, leaving him in that covered darkness until a day of judgment still to come, at which point he will finally be cast into fire. Some versions of the text name this specific location Judean, a desert region whose exact geography scholars still debate, though the broader point being made seems less concerned with precise cartography and more with the emotional weight of the punishment itself. Exile, darkness, burial beneath stone, a complete and total removal from the world he had once moved through so freely. There's a detail here worth sitting with, because I think it reveals something important about how this ancient author understood justice and restoration together as a single, connected act. Raphael isn't instructed only to punish Azazel. He's also instructed, in the very same breath, to heal the earth itself, to restore the ground that had been corrupted by everything Azazel and the other watchers had taught and unleashed upon it. Punishment and healing in this story aren't separate acts happening in sequence. They're presented as two halves of a single, necessary restoration, the removal of the source of corruption paired directly with the active repair of the damage that corruption had caused. I find that pairing genuinely moving, actually, and worth carrying with you for a moment. It suggests an understanding of justice that isn't simply about punishment for its own sake, retribution as an end in itself, but about restoration, about actively putting a broken world back into something resembling its proper, healthy order. The text doesn't leave the earth simply punished and abandoned. It leaves it, deliberately, in the process of being healed. The Archangel Michael, meanwhile, is given a different assignment, dealing directly with Shemiheza and the rest of the Watchers who had joined that original oath at Mount Hermon. According to the text, Michael is instructed to bind them, and to leave them bound beneath the earth, or in some versions in a specific valley, for 70 generations, until the great day of judgment when their final sentence will be carried out. 70 generations is a striking number to land on, and worth pausing over, because it suggests a punishment stretching not across mere years or decades, but across an almost unimaginably vast expanse of human time, generation after generation of ordinary human families living out their entire lives, entirely unaware that somewhere beneath their feet, bound and waiting, the beings whose original transgression had once devastated their ancient ancestors' world remained imprisoned still. Their final judgment endlessly, patiently deferred. And what of the giants themselves, those violent, insatiable offspring of the Watchers and human women, the Nephilim who had consumed the earth's labor and turned to violence against humanity and animal alike? The text handles their fate somewhat differently. Rather than a clean, singular act of binding or exile, the Nephilim are described as turning ultimately against one another, destroying each other in a spiral of mutual violence, their own monstrous nature, once loosed upon the world, eventually consuming itself. It's a grimly fitting resolution when you sit with it for a moment, a form of violence so total and unchecked that it eventually has nowhere left to turn except inward, upon its own source. I want to pause here and connect this back to something we discussed earlier tonight, the deep, ancient anxiety about power and knowledge arriving faster than the wisdom needed to govern it responsibly. There's a genuine, coherent moral logic running through this entire judgment sequence, even beneath its strange, ancient imagery. Corrupted knowledge and corrupted power, once fully unleashed, don't simply run indefinitely. They eventually consume themselves, turn against their own source, collapse under the weight of their own unchecked excess. It's a genuinely sobering idea to carry with you into sleep tonight, and I'd argue, one that doesn't require any particular religious belief to feel true. Amid all of this judgment and restoration, the story doesn't forget about the ordinary human world we spent so much time understanding earlier tonight, the world of terraced hillsides and ground grain and careful, anxious attention to the rains. According to the broader tradition surrounding this story, one man among the corrupted, violent generation is found worthy of preservation, warned in advance of the coming flood, and instructed to build a vessel that will carry his family and representatives of every living creature, safely through the devastation about to be unleashed. That man, of course, is Noah, and here the Book of Enoch's ancient, elaborate story of watchers and giants and forbidden knowledge finally rejoins the more familiar biblical account most listeners tonight already carry somewhere in their memory. The flood, the ark, the long, patient waiting for dry land to reappear. I want you to imagine for just a moment being Noah in this expanded version of the story, carrying not just the ordinary human knowledge of an approaching, devastating storm, but the full, terrible understanding of exactly why it was coming, the watchers, the giants, the corrupted knowledge, the violence that had filled every corner of the world he'd grown up in. Imagine the particular, heavy weight of building that ark not in ignorance, but in complete awareness of the scale of the catastrophe that had made it necessary, and of the strange, sobering privilege of being the one household chosen to carry the world's future safely through the flood and into whatever came next. The Book of Enoch, in its fuller telling, doesn't end with the flood itself, but continues much further, into visions of history stretching forward across generations Enoch is shown but will never personally witness, and eventually toward visions of final judgment, of a world ultimately restored and set right, echoing, in its own strange, ancient imagery, that same core hope we've circled back to again and again tonight, that a broken, corrupted world can, eventually, through whatever difficult process is required, be healed and returned to something resembling its proper order. For our purposes tonight, though, I think we've walked far enough through the story itself. What remains is arguably just as fascinating as anything we've covered so far, the true, documented story of what happened to this remarkable ancient text after it was written, how it very nearly vanished from human memory entirely, and the genuinely unlikely chain of events that allowed it to survive, preserved almost by accident, in one distant corner of the world, waiting patiently for nearly 1,000 years until it could finally make its way back into wider circulation. Life by the Dead Sea. Before we follow this book on its long journey out of Judea and into the wider world, I want to take you back one more time to the place where we started tonight, that stretch of harsh, silent landscape above the Dead Sea. And this time I want us to imagine the community who actually lived there. The people most scholars believe were responsible for copying, preserving, and treasuring the very scrolls that boys stumbled upon centuries after their deaths. The ruins at Qumran itself, extensively excavated since the scrolls were first discovered, reveal a settlement that was clearly organized, clearly intentional, and clearly quite different from the ordinary agricultural villages we spent time in earlier tonight. Archaeologists have identified what appears to be a large communal dining hall, an extensive network of cisterns and channels for collecting and storing the scarce, precious rainwater that made any settlement in this brutal landscape possible at all, workshops, and most significantly for our story tonight, what many scholars believe was a dedicated scriptorium, a room specifically set aside for the careful, disciplined work of copying manuscripts by hand. Most historians connect this community with a Jewish sect mentioned by several ancient writers of the period, called the Essenes, though I want to be honest with you that this identification, while widely accepted, isn't entirely without scholarly debate, and I think that honesty matters on a night when we're trying to separate solid historical ground from more uncertain territory. What does seem clear, both from the physical layout of the site and from the content of many scrolls found there, is that this was a community organized around unusually strict discipline, ritual purity, and a deep, almost consuming devotion to religious study and copying of sacred text. Let's imagine, for a moment, what a single day might have looked like for a member of this community, because it stands in fascinating contrast to the agricultural rhythms we walked through earlier. Ancient descriptions of communities like this one, along with what archaeologists have pieced together from the site itself, suggest a life built around shared meals, shared labor, and long, disciplined stretches of study and prayer. Members are described as rising early, working through the practical labor needed to sustain the community, tending whatever limited agriculture the harsh surrounding terrain allowed, maintaining the elaborate water systems the settlement depended on entirely for survival, before gathering again for communal meals eaten together in near total silence, a practice ancient writers specifically noted as unusual and striking compared to the more relaxed, conversational meals of ordinary Jewish households elsewhere in the region. I want you to imagine the particular quiet of that scriptorium room, because I think it's one of the more beautiful, overlooked images connected to tonight's story. Picture a small chamber, walls of the same pale local stone we described earlier, a long, low table or bench running along one side, and seated there a scribe, bent carefully over a sheet of prepared animal skin or papyrus, a reed pen in hand, an inkwell nearby mixed from soot, gum, and water, copying letter by patient letter, the words of an ancient text, perhaps this very Book of Enoch we've spent tonight exploring together. This was not fast, casual work. Copying a text of any length by hand, letter by letter, line by line, checking constantly for accuracy, because an error copied once might be copied again and again by future scribes working from a now flawed exemplar, could take an enormous, sustained amount of time and concentration. Some ancient Jewish scribal traditions describe extraordinarily strict rules governing exactly this kind of work. Rules about ritual purification before beginning, about the precise number of lines permitted per column, about what to do if even a single letter was copied incorrectly, sometimes requiring an entire sheet to be discarded and restarted rather than simply corrected. Whether this particular community followed rules quite that exacting, we can't say with total certainty, but the physical evidence of the scrolls themselves, remarkably careful and consistent lettering across thousands of lines, tells its own quiet story about the discipline and devotion involved. I want you to sit with the emotional texture of that work for a moment, because I think it connects directly to why we're able to have this conversation at all tonight. Somewhere in that scriptorium, a person whose name we will never know, working by whatever light filtered through a small window or by the glow of a simple oil lamp, spent hours, days, weeks of their finite human life carefully copying out, letter by letter, a story about angels descending a mountain, about forbidden knowledge, about a world grown violent and a flood sent to cleanse it. They almost certainly had no idea that nearly 2,000 years later, that same careful, patient labor would allow people scattered across an entire globe they couldn't have imagined, listening on devices they couldn't have conceived of, to still encounter the very words they were so carefully preserving. There's something worth carrying with you into sleep tonight in that thought. So much of what allows any of us to understand the deep past at all rests on this kind of quiet, unglamorous, deeply patient labor. Someone somewhere, choosing to preserve something carefully, without any guarantee that their effort would ever be recognized or rewarded, simply because the material itself seemed worth protecting. This community's story, like so many from this turbulent period we discussed earlier, eventually ended in upheaval. Most scholars believe the settlement at Qumran was abandoned or destroyed sometime around the year 70 of the Common Era, during the broader chaos of the Great Jewish Revolt against Roman rule, a catastrophic conflict that also saw the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem itself. It's widely believed that in the face of this advancing danger, members of the community made the decision to hide their precious collection of scrolls in the surrounding caves, wrapping them carefully, sealing them into those tall clay jars we described at the very beginning of tonight's story, hoping, presumably, to return for them once the danger had passed. They never did return. Whether they were killed in the surrounding violence, scattered and unable to make their way back, or simply lost track across the passing decades of exactly which cave held which collection, we simply don't know and probably never will with any certainty. What we do know with complete confidence is that those sealed jars sat in patient, undisturbed darkness for nearly 19 centuries, through the entire rise and fall of the Roman Empire, through the spread of Christianity and Islam across this same landscape, through the Crusades, through the rise and fall of countless further kingdoms and empires, until a bored teenage shepherd, chasing a stray goat on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, happened to throw a stone into the right cave at exactly the right moment. There's a particular kind of quiet wonder in that, worth sitting with as we move toward the final stretch of tonight's story. And it's not the only remarkable chain of accident and preservation connected to the Book of Enoch either. Because while those Qumran scrolls sat hidden and forgotten in their desert caves, an entirely separate, and in some ways even more remarkable, story of preservation was unfolding in a completely different corner of the ancient and medieval world, one that ensured this strange, beautiful old text never fully disappeared from active religious use at all. Let's go there next. The book that would not die. While the Qumran scrolls sat hidden in their desert caves, and while, across the wider Mediterranean world, the Book of Enoch gradually faded from mainstream Jewish and Christian religious use, something quite different was happening far to the south, in the ancient highland kingdoms of what is today Ethiopia. Christianity arrived in this region remarkably early, traditionally traced to the 4th century of the Common Era, when the kingdom of Aksum, a genuinely significant ancient power controlling trade routes across the Red Sea and deep into the African interior, adopted Christianity as its official religion, making it one of the very first states anywhere in the world to do so. Over the centuries that followed, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church developed its own distinct theological and canonical traditions, somewhat separate from the councils and debates that were simultaneously shaping the biblical canon across the rest of the Christian world. And within that distinct Ethiopian tradition, the Book of Enoch never fell out of favor at all. It was translated into Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church, still used in religious services there today much the way Latin was long used in Western Christian tradition, and it was preserved, copied, and treated as genuine scripture continuously, generation after generation, monastery after monastery, for well over 1,000 years, right through the exact same centuries when the rest of the Christian and Jewish world had largely forgotten the text existed at all. Beyond the occasional passing reference in the writings of a handful of early church scholars, this is genuinely remarkable when you sit with it. While European scholars and religious authorities were left with only second-hand references and quotations, unable to actually read the full text of the Book of Enoch for themselves, monks in Ethiopian highland monasteries were copying it out by hand, reading it aloud in worship, treating it as an accepted, integral part of their biblical canon, completely unaware, or at least largely unconcerned, that the wider Christian world had let the book slip almost entirely out of circulation. The story of how this Ethiopian tradition eventually reconnected with the rest of the world brings us to a genuinely colorful figure, a Scottish traveler and diplomat named James Bruce, who undertook an extraordinary, difficult, and often dangerous journey through Ethiopia in the 1760s and early 1770s, driven largely by his own personal obsession with locating the source of the Blue Nile River. Bruce was, by most contemporary accounts, an imposing, larger-than-life figure, well over 6 feet tall in an era when that was genuinely unusual, fluent in Arabic, and possessed of an almost relentless determination that carried him through years of difficult travel across a region most Europeans of his era had never set foot in and knew almost nothing about. During his extended time in Ethiopia, moving through royal courts and religious communities, Bruce encountered copies of texts, including the Book of Enoch, that had essentially vanished from circulation everywhere else in the world. When he eventually returned to Europe in 1773, after years away, he brought with him several manuscript copies of the Book of Enoch in its Ge'ez translation, effectively reintroducing this ancient, almost entirely forgotten text to Western scholarship after a gap stretching back well over 1,000 years. I want you to imagine, for a moment, what that reintroduction must have felt like to the small community of European scholars capable of appreciating its significance. Here was a text that early Christian writers had quoted, referenced, and occasionally argued fiercely about, that the New Testament epistle of Jude had directly cited, that had shaped, in ways not always fully acknowledged, early Jewish and Christian ideas about angels, judgment, and the origins of evil, and yet which had been essentially unreadable, existing only as scattered second-hand references for well over a millennium. And now, suddenly, thanks to one determined traveler's journey through a distant highland kingdom most of Europe knew almost nothing about, complete manuscript copies were sitting in European libraries once again. Even then, the process of bringing this text to a wider English-speaking audience took decades longer. It wasn't until 1821 that an English translation, produced by an Oxford scholar named Richard Lawrence, working directly from Bruce's Ethiopian manuscripts, finally made the full text of the Book of Enoch broadly available to English readers for the first time in essentially the entire history of the English language. And it wasn't until decades after that, as the study of the Ge'ez manuscript tradition deepened and matured throughout the 19th century, that scholars began to more fully appreciate the extraordinary depth, complexity, and historical significance of the text they now had complete access to. There's a particularly satisfying symmetry worth pausing on here, connecting this Ethiopian preservation story back to where we started tonight, in that desert cave above the Dead Sea. When the Qumran scrolls were finally discovered in the 1940s, and scholars found among them Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch dating back over 2,000 years, they were able to compare these ancient fragments directly against the Ethiopian Ge'ez text that had been continuously preserved and copied, generation after generation, in those highland monasteries. And remarkably, despite the vast distance in time, language, and geography separating a first-century Aramaic fragment sealed in a desert cave from a medieval Ethiopian monk's careful copy made 1,000 years later, The correspondence between the two traditions was, by most scholarly assessment, genuinely striking. Two completely independent chains of preservation, one frozen in place inside sealed clay jars for 19 centuries, the other kept continuously alive through unbroken generations of devoted copying in a distant highland kingdom, had managed to carry essentially the same ancient text forward across 2,000 years of human history. I think that's worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because it speaks to something genuinely moving about human devotion to preserving meaningful ideas across time. Two entirely different communities, separated by enormous distances of geography and centuries of history, each independently decided this particular text mattered enough to protect, to copy carefully, to pass down to people they would never meet, in a future they couldn't possibly have imagined. And because of that shared, quiet devotion, spread across 2 continents and 2,000 years, we're able to sit here together tonight, in whatever corner of the modern world you happen to be listening from, and encounter this same ancient story for ourselves. Why it was left out? I promised you earlier tonight that we'd come back to the question of exactly why the Book of Enoch, despite its clear early popularity, its influence on other texts, and its direct citation in the New Testament itself, eventually ended up excluded from the official biblical canon almost everywhere except that one preserved Ethiopian tradition. I think the answer is genuinely interesting, and it tells us something valuable about how religious communities across history have wrestled with the difficult, ongoing question of exactly which ancient texts deserve to be treated as authoritative scripture, and which, however beloved or influential, ultimately don't make that final cut. We mentioned earlier that the short New Testament epistle of Jude quotes the Book of Enoch directly, naming Enoch by name and citing a specific prophecy about divine judgment. This wasn't a small or incidental detail to early Christian communities grappling with which texts belonged in their emerging canon. If a book included in the New Testament directly quoted another text as though it carried real authority, what did that imply about the authority of the source text itself? Early Christian writers actually debated this question quite seriously and quite openly. Some prominent early Christian voices spoke favorably of the Book of Enoch. The theologian Tertullian, writing in North Africa in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries of the Common Era, defended the book's authenticity and authority directly, arguing that its use by the Apostle Jude was sufficient reason to accept it as genuinely valuable, even sacred, scripture. Other early writers, including figures connected to the influential Alexandrian school of Christian thought, showed clear familiarity with and interest in the text as well. But other voices pushed in the opposite direction, and over time, these voices largely won out across most of the wider Christian and Jewish world. Some later church authorities expressed genuine theological discomfort with the book's vivid, physically detailed account of angelic beings taking human wives, a concept that sat uneasily alongside developing theological understandings of the nature of angels as purely spiritual beings without physical bodies or physical desires in the way the Book of Enoch seems to assume. The influential theologian Augustine, writing in the early 5th century, expressed skepticism about the book's antiquity and authenticity, questioning whether it could genuinely trace back to the ancient figure of Enoch himself, given how implausible it seemed that such a text could have survived, unaltered, across the vast span of time the tradition claimed. There's an interesting irony worth pausing on here, given everything we've discussed tonight. Augustine's skepticism about the book's ability to survive intact across such an enormous span of time turned out, in a sense, to be at least partially answered nearly 15 centuries after he wrote those words, when the Qumran fragments demonstrated that versions of this text genuinely had been circulating, largely stable in content, for well over 2,000 years by that point. Augustine wasn't wrong to be cautious. Caution, generally, is a reasonable instinct when evaluating ancient claims. But the specific grounds of his skepticism, that such long-term textual survival simply wasn't plausible, turned out to be a case where the historical record eventually proved more surprising than even a careful, skeptical ancient scholar had anticipated. As the process of formally settling the Christian biblical canon continued across the following centuries, different regional church councils and traditions made different final decisions, and the broader consensus that eventually solidified across most of the Catholic and Protestant traditions in the West, and across most of mainstream rabbinic Judaism as well, ultimately excluded the Book of Enoch from the accepted, authoritative canon. Only in Ethiopia, where the Tewahedo Church had developed its own distinct canonical tradition, somewhat outside the direct influence of these Western and broader Mediterranean debates, did the book retain its place as recognized scripture, continuously, right up through today. I think it's worth resisting any temptation to frame this story as one of simple, deliberate suppression, a shadowy effort to hide dangerous or forbidden knowledge from ordinary believers, a framing that's become fairly popular in certain corners of modern internet discussion around this topic. The actual historical record, as best we can reconstruct it, points instead to something more mundane, and honestly more human, a genuine, extended, good-faith theological debate among religious communities trying to determine, across several centuries, and without any single central authority dictating the outcome, exactly which ancient texts should carry the weight of Scripture and which, however valuable or historically interesting, ultimately shouldn't. Different communities, weighing the same evidence and the same theological concerns, reasonably reached different conclusions, and those differing conclusions have simply persisted, largely unchanged, right down to today. What's genuinely remarkable, I think, is less the fact that most of the world set the book aside, and more the fact that it survived at all, through that one unbroken Ethiopian tradition, patiently waiting across 1,000 years of separation from the rest of world Christianity, until a curious, determined Scottish traveler happened to bring copies back to Europe, and until, nearly 2 centuries after that, a shepherd boy happened to throw a stone into exactly the right cave above the Dead Sea. Neither of those events was inevitable. Both, in their own way, were remarkable strokes of historical accident, and without either one, this particular ancient story, one that so clearly captured the imagination of the community that first embraced it, might genuinely have been lost to us entirely, reduced to nothing more than a handful of second-hand references in other, better preserved texts. Today, of course, the Book of Enoch enjoys a level of popular attention it likely hasn't seen since those ancient centuries when Jewish communities in Judea first passed it hand to hand, scroll to scroll, household to household. It circulates widely, discussed and debated across countless corners of the modern internet, referenced constantly in books, videos, and conversations exploring ancient mysteries and forgotten history, sometimes with real scholarly care, and sometimes, it's worth being honest, with considerably less care than the actual historical record deserves. I hope tonight has managed to walk that difficult line carefully, giving you the genuine, documented history where solid history exists, while being honest and clear about where we're standing instead on ancient belief, ancient mythology, and the enduring, deeply human fears that gave rise to it. The last days before the rain. Let's slow all the way down now and spend some real time inside the final stretch of this ancient story, the days just before the flood itself arrives. I want to imagine this carefully with you, the way the earliest tellers of this tale might have imagined it themselves, blending what little the ancient texts actually tell us with the same kind of grounded, sensory detail we used earlier tonight to imagine an ordinary morning in Judea. Picture Noah, according to this old tradition, as a man who has spent years, according to some traditions as long as a century, engaged in a task that must have looked, to nearly everyone around him, like the strange, obsessive project of someone who had lost touch with ordinary reality. Building a vessel of that scale, according to the measurements given in the ancient account, roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high, using nothing but hand tools, wooden pegs and pitch worked carefully into every seam by hand, was not a task accomplished quickly or quietly. It would have been visible from a considerable distance, an enormous, strange structure rising on dry land, nowhere near any sea or navigable river large enough to ever actually float something of that size under ordinary circumstances. I want you to imagine what it must have been like to be a neighbor of Noah's household during those long years, watching this project slowly take shape. Imagine walking past it on your way to the terraced fields each morning, watching the timber framework grow taller season after season, hearing the steady, rhythmic sound of tools against wood carrying across the still morning air, smelling the sharp, resinous scent of pitch being heated and worked into the hull's seams. Imagine the conversations this must have generated among neighbors, some amused, some irritated, some perhaps genuinely uneasy, without quite being able to articulate why. In a world we've spent tonight coming to understand as one governed by careful, communal, interdependent labor, terraces built and maintained across generations, water shared and rationed carefully, an entire community's survival dependent on everyone contributing their expected part, a single household spending years of labor and resources on a structure that served no obvious agricultural or practical purpose would have been, at minimum, deeply strange, and quite possibly a source of real social tension. According to the fuller tradition surrounding this story, one that draws on both the Genesis account and the additional detail found in texts like the Book of Enoch, Noah's task wasn't simply physical construction. He's also described, in various strands of this tradition, as a preacher of righteousness, someone who spent these same long years attempting, apparently without much success, to warn his neighbors and his wider community about the judgment he understood to be approaching, urging a change of course that, according to the story's own grim accounting, essentially nobody outside his immediate household ultimately heeded. I want you to sit with the particular loneliness embedded in that detail for a moment, because I think it's one of the more quietly devastating aspects of the entire story, easy to skip past in a quick retelling, but worth lingering over on a slow night like this one. Imagine carrying for years a genuine, deeply held conviction about an approaching catastrophe, attempting again and again to share that conviction with the people around you, neighbors, extended family, people you'd grown up alongside and worked beside on those same terraced hillsides, and watching that warning received, again and again, with indifference, skepticism, or outright mockery. Imagine the particular ache of continuing to show up each day, to build, to warn, to hope, even as the evidence accumulated that almost no one around you was going to change course. Let's imagine, too, the ordinary texture of daily life continuing all around this strange, unfinished vessel during these same years, because I think it's important not to let the dramatic framing of impending catastrophe erase the very human, very ordinary rhythms we spent so much time understanding earlier tonight. Somewhere nearby, a family is still grinding grain before dawn. Children are still being sent to fetch water, still playing in whatever spare hour the day's labor allows, still falling asleep against a parent's shoulder as evening settles in. Olive trees are still being tended, grapes still pressed, bread still baked fresh each morning against the hot inner wall of a clay oven. Life, in other words, according to this account, simply continued, ordinary and unremarkable, right up until the very last possible moment, largely unaware or unwilling to fully believe that anything was about to change at all. There's something worth sitting with in that particular detail, something that shows up again and again across flood traditions from across the ancient world, including, as we discussed earlier tonight, the remarkably similar Mesopotamian accounts recovered from those buried tablets at Nineveh. In nearly every version of this story, across nearly every culture that told some form of it, the coming catastrophe is described as arriving into a world still going about its completely ordinary business, entirely unprepared, right up until the moment it becomes impossible to ignore any longer. I think that detail resonates precisely because it captures something genuinely true about how catastrophe, of almost any kind, tends to actually unfold in real human experience. Rarely does disaster announce itself clearly and unmistakably in advance, giving everyone ample, unambiguous warning. More often, life simply continues in its ordinary, familiar rhythm, right up until the moment it very suddenly doesn't. According to the account, when the appointed time finally arrives, Noah gathers his household, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, 8 people in total according to the tradition, along with the carefully gathered animals, into the finished vessel. And the door, according to the striking detail preserved in the Genesis account, is shut not by Noah himself but by God directly. A small but genuinely powerful narrative detail suggesting a kind of finality, a decision now entirely out of human hands. The long window for change and warning finally, completely closed. And then, according to the ancient account, the rains begin. Not a passing storm, not the seasonal, anxiously awaited rainfall the terraced hillsides of Judea depended on each year for survival, but something categorically different, described in the text as the breaking open of the very fountains of the great deep, alongside the opening of the windows of heaven itself. Imagery suggesting not merely heavy rainfall, but something closer to the complete, catastrophic collapse of the ordinary boundaries, separating water above from water below. Exactly the kind of total dissolution of proper cosmic order that the entire story, going all the way back to those watchers descending Mount Hermon, has been building toward the whole time. I want you to imagine for just a moment what 40 days and 40 nights of that kind of unrelenting rain would have actually sounded like, and felt like, from inside a wooden vessel like the one described, no engines, no electric lighting, nothing but oil lamps carefully rationed and animal sounds, and the constant, unending drumming of rain against a wooden hull, the vessel itself groaning and shifting with the movement of rising, churning water beneath it. Imagine the particular, disorienting sensation of a floor that no longer sits still, day after day, night after night, with no clear indication of how long this state of affairs might continue, or what, if anything, might still exist once it finally ended. The ancient account doesn't linger extensively on this period of floating isolation, moving relatively quickly toward the eventual subsiding of the waters, the vessel coming to rest, according to the tradition, upon the mountains of Ararat, and the careful, patient process of sending out birds, first a raven, then a dove, repeated attempts to determine whether dry land had genuinely reappeared anywhere within reach. I find that detail, the sending of birds, genuinely moving every time I sit with it, because it represents such a small, careful, deeply human act of hope amid overwhelming uncertainty. No way to see beyond the vessel's own walls, no way to know directly what state the wider world might be in. Only the patient, repeated act of releasing a small creature and watching carefully to see whether, and how, it returns. When dry land is finally confirmed, when the waters have receded enough for the vessel's inhabitants to finally step out onto solid ground again, the ancient account describes something genuinely striking, an act of worship and gratitude performed immediately, before almost anything else, before rebuilding, before assessing damage, before beginning the enormous task of restarting an entire world's worth of agriculture and community from what amounts to a single surviving household. And in response, according to the tradition, comes a promise, marked by the appearance of a rainbow, that a catastrophe of this particular, total scale would never again be visited upon the earth. I think it's worth sitting with that promise for a moment as we begin to move toward the close of tonight's story, because it represents something genuinely important about how this entire ancient tradition, spanning the Book of Enoch's elaborate account of watchers and giants and forbidden knowledge, all the way through to the more familiar Genesis account of Noah and the Ark, ultimately resolves. This isn't, in the end, simply a story about catastrophic judgment. It's a story that insists, quite deliberately, on ending with restoration, with promise, with the deliberate, hopeful reestablishment of ordinary life continuing forward from this point. An old fear wearing many faces. I mentioned earlier tonight that the flood story we've been walking through, and the broader anxiety about a corrupted world requiring some kind of catastrophic reset, wasn't unique to the Jewish and Mesopotamian traditions we've focused on so far. I think it's worth taking a slower, more careful look at just how widespread this particular story shape actually is across human cultures, because I find something genuinely comforting, in a strange way, about recognizing just how universal certain fears and certain hopes turn out to be, once you start looking closely enough. In ancient Greek tradition, a strikingly similar story centers on a figure named Deucalion, son of Prometheus, the very same titan we mentioned briefly earlier tonight in connection with the theft of fire. According to this Greek account, the god Zeus, troubled by the wickedness and violence that had come to characterize the current age of humanity, decides to send a great flood to destroy it entirely. Prometheus, forewarned of his sons coming and wanting to protect him, advises Deucalion to build a chest, sometimes described as a wooden ark, and to stock it with provisions. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survive the resulting deluge, and afterward, according to one particularly memorable version of the myth, repopulate the devastated earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, stones that miraculously transform into new human beings as they land. There's something worth noticing in the shape of that story, The same core elements arranged again in familiar order: divine anger at human wickedness, a single family forewarned and spared, a period of devastating flood, and eventually a fresh, deliberate restart for the human population. The specific details differ considerably from the Jewish and Mesopotamian versions we spent time with earlier, but the underlying emotional architecture of the story, judgment, survival, and restoration, appears again with genuine consistency. Traveling much further east, Hindu tradition preserves its own remarkably similar account, found in several ancient texts, including the Shatapatha Brahmana and later elaborated in various Puranas, centering on a figure named Manu, often considered the progenitor of the human race in this tradition. In this story, Manu is warned of an approaching, catastrophic flood by a small fish he had once shown kindness to, a fish who grows to an enormous size and eventually reveals itself as an avatar of the god Vishnu. Following the fish's instructions, Manu builds a boat, and when the flood arrives, ties his vessel to the fish's horn, being towed safely through the deluge to eventual safety atop a mountain peak, where he alone survives to begin humanity anew. I find the specific detail of the fish in this tradition genuinely lovely to sit with for a moment, a small act of kindness toward an apparently insignificant creature eventually returning, transformed, as the very source of salvation from total catastrophe. It's a different emotional emphasis than the more judgment-focused Mesopotamian and Jewish traditions we discussed earlier, placing gratitude and reciprocity at the center of the survival story, rather than simple divine selection based on righteousness alone, though righteousness and right conduct certainly matter in this tradition too. Moving to Mesoamerica, the Popol Vuh, a foundational sacred narrative of the Iche Maya people, preserved in written form after European contact, but drawing on much older oral tradition, describes an earlier age of humanity fashioned entirely from wood, beings who could speak and move but lacked souls, memory, and any genuine devotion to the gods who had created them. Displeased with these wooden people's emptiness and ingratitude, the gods send a great flood, along with, in a genuinely unsettling detail, a rebellion of the wooden people's own household objects and animals rising up against them, to destroy this failed, hollow version of humanity, clearing the way for the eventual creation of true human beings, according to this tradition, fashioned instead from maize. And in ancient Chinese tradition, we find yet another variation, this one centered less on divine judgment against human wickedness, and more on the heroic, painstaking human effort required to manage and eventually control catastrophic, world-threatening floodwaters. The legendary figures Gun and his son Yu are described across centuries of Chinese textual tradition as struggling, across multiple generations, to control a great flood threatening the entire known world, with Yu eventually succeeding where his father had failed, through years of tireless, personal labor dredging channels and guiding the floodwaters safely to the sea, an achievement so significant within Chinese tradition that Yu is remembered as the legendary founder of the Xia dynasty, China's very first dynasty according to traditional historical accounts. I want you to sit with the sheer geographic and cultural spread of these stories for a moment, because I think it's genuinely worth pausing on as we move toward the close of tonight's journey. Judea, Mesopotamia, Greece, India, Mesoamerica, China, civilizations separated by enormous distances, by centuries and often millennia of independent development, by languages and religious systems that shared essentially no direct historical contact with one another in many cases. And yet, again and again, arriving at strikingly similar core stories. A world grown corrupted or unbalanced, a devastating flood as the mechanism of judgment or cleansing. A small group of survivors preserved through some combination of divine favor, personal virtue, or simple forewarning, and a subsequent, deliberate restart of human civilization from that surviving remnant. Scholars have proposed a range of explanations for why this particular story shape recurs so consistently across such disconnected cultures. And I think it's honest to say that no single explanation has achieved anything like universal consensus. Some point to the simple, practical reality that human civilizations across the ancient world overwhelmingly settled near rivers, coastlines, and low-lying fertile land precisely because that same land was fertile and accessible, and that this same geography made catastrophic flooding, whether from unusually severe seasonal rains, sudden river course changes, or coastal surges, a genuinely recurring lived experience across an enormous number of ancient societies, providing more than enough real, remembered disaster to eventually crystallize into shared mythological memory. Others point toward the more universal psychological and moral logic these stories share, noting that nearly every human culture eventually develops some story explaining why the world contains suffering and injustice, and that a story of judgment followed by cleansing and restoration offers a genuinely satisfying, coherent shape for that explanation, regardless of the specific geography or climate a given culture happened to develop within. I don't think we need to fully resolve that scholarly debate tonight, and I'm genuinely not in a position to tell you which explanation, or what combination of explanations, comes closest to the full truth. What I find worth sitting with instead, on a slow, quiet night like this one, is simply the fact of that recurrence itself. Something in the shared, ancient human experience, whether rooted in genuine, remembered catastrophe, in universal patterns of moral reasoning, or in some combination the scholarly record may never fully untangle, kept leading separate, disconnected cultures back toward remarkably similar stories. Stories about a world becoming unbalanced, about judgment arriving, and crucially, in nearly every single version about restoration, eventually following that judgment, life continuing forward. However scarred and however humbled on the other side of catastrophe, what the old book still asks. We've traveled a long way together tonight, from a boy chasing a lost goat into a cave above the Dead Sea, back through the anxious, embattled centuries of Second Temple Judea, up the snow-covered slopes of Mount Hermon, through fields consumed by insatiable giants, into the throne room of heaven itself, alongside a mortal scribe who somehow survived the encounter, down into the quiet, disciplined scriptorium of a desert community copying scripture by hand, across an ocean and a continent to the highland monasteries of Ethiopia, and finally into a wooden vessel rocking through 40 days and nights of unrelenting rain. I want to take a little time now, as we begin winding down toward sleep, to sit with what all of this might actually mean, or at least what I find myself sitting with, having spent so much time inside this old, strange, remarkably persistent story. I don't think the Book of Enoch, at its heart, is really a story about angels at all, even though angels populate nearly every page of it. I think it's a story about power, and specifically about what happens when power, whether the power of physical strength, of specialized knowledge, of social position, or of simple, unchecked authority, becomes untethered from any sense of proper limit or accountability. The Watchers weren't punished, in this story's own telling, simply for desiring something beyond their assigned place. They were punished because that desire, once acted upon without restraint, cascaded outward into consequences none of them could fully control, consequences that ultimately devastated a world that had never asked for any of it and had no power to defend itself against it. I think that's worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because it's a fear that doesn't actually require any belief in literal angels or literal giants to feel genuinely, urgently relevant. Every generation, including our own, has watched some form of power, some form of newly unlocked capability, some form of knowledge or technology, arrive faster than the surrounding wisdom needed to hold it responsibly, and has felt, in its own way, some echo of that same old anxiety the anonymous Judean scribes were working through over 2,000 years ago, as they imagined Azazel teaching humanity the forging of iron and the reddening of cheeks. The specific technologies change. The underlying human vulnerability, watching capability outpace conscience, does not. I also think there's something genuinely worth carrying forward from the quieter, less dramatic corners of this story, the parts that don't involve giants or cosmic judgment at all. I think about Enoch himself, walking with God, according to that single strange, beautiful phrase from Genesis, not through any grand, dramatic act of heroism, but simply, as the text implies, through a long, sustained, ordinary faithfulness that eventually became something extraordinary. I think about the scribe in that quiet Qumran scriptorium, copying letter after careful letter with no guarantee anyone would ever read the work, simply because the material seemed worth preserving. I think about generations of Ethiopian monks. In highland monasteries most of the ancient Mediterranean world barely knew existed, quietly keeping a tradition alive across 1,000 years of separation from the rest of Christendom, simply because it mattered to them, regardless of whether anyone elsewhere was paying attention. None of these figures appear in this story as dramatic, larger-than-life heroes. They appear as patient, largely anonymous people, doing careful, unglamorous work, trusting that it mattered even without any guarantee of recognition or reward. And I think there's something genuinely worth carrying into your own life from that quiet, unglamorous pattern, whatever your own beliefs about angels, giants, or ancient floods might be. So much of what actually holds a world together, what actually preserves what's valuable across generations, what actually heals what's been broken, tends to come not from dramatic, singular acts of heroism, but from exactly this kind of patient, sustained, often unrecognized faithfulness, shown up for day after day, letter after careful letter, generation after generation. There's one more thread I want to leave you with before we close things out completely tonight, and it circles back to something we touched on earlier, that recurring detail across so many of these ancient flood traditions: Jewish, Mesopotamian, Greek, Hindu, Mesoamerican, Chinese, where judgment is never allowed to be the final word. Every single one of these traditions insists in its own particular cultural language that catastrophe, however total, however devastating, eventually gives way to restoration. The waters recede. Dry land reappears. A rainbow is offered as a promise against total, final destruction ever repeating. New human beings are shaped from maize, or from stones thrown over a shoulder, or from the patient rebuilding of a single surviving family stepping out of a wooden vessel onto solid, muddy ground for the very first time in months. I think that consistent insistence on eventual restoration, appearing again and again across cultures that otherwise had no direct contact with one another, tells us something genuinely hopeful about the deep, shared architecture of human storytelling. However dark, however corrupted, however violent a story about the world's condition becomes, across nearly every ancient tradition that ever wrestled seriously with that darkness, the story doesn't end there. It ends, instead, with someone stepping back out onto dry ground, with a fresh beginning, however humbled and however hard one, extended forward into whatever comes next. I find that a genuinely good thought to fall asleep on tonight. Whatever else you take from this long, slow walk through an old and strange and remarkably resilient piece of ancient storytelling. Whatever feels corrupted or overwhelming in your own life right now, whatever flood, literal or otherwise, you might feel yourself currently sitting inside, the oldest stories human beings have ever told each other, across every corner of this planet, from the Judean hills to the Mesopotamian floodplains to the Ethiopian highlands to the Chinese river valleys, seem to agree on at least this much. The water recedes eventually. Dry ground reappears. And somewhere on the other side of whatever's overwhelming right now, life, patient and stubborn and quietly hopeful, finds its way to continue forward. The figure in the clouds. Before we close things out completely tonight, I want to share one more thread from this remarkable old text, because I think it's genuinely fascinating, and it connects the Book of Enoch to a much wider, much more famous story than anything we've discussed so far tonight. We mentioned earlier that the Book of Enoch is really a collection of 5 originally separate works, and so far tonight we've focused almost entirely on the oldest of these, the Book of the Watchers, along with brief mention of the astronomical book describing Enoch's journey through the movements of the heavens. But there's a third section, generally called the Book of Parables, or sometimes the Similitudes of Enoch, that scholars typically date somewhat later than the material we've spent most of tonight exploring, likely sometime around the 1st century before the Common Era, though this dating remains genuinely debated among specialists. And I want to be honest with you about that uncertainty rather than presenting it as more settled than it actually is. This section of the text describes further visions granted to Enoch during his heavenly journeys and introduces a figure the text calls, among other titles, the Son of Man, described in genuinely striking, exalted language, a pre-existent, heavenly figure, hidden from the beginning of creation, destined to eventually sit upon a throne of glory and execute righteous judgment over the entire earth, casting down the proud and the mighty from their seats of power, and vindicating the righteous and oppressed who had suffered under them. I want you to sit with that description for a moment, because if you have any familiarity at all with the New Testament, something in that language likely just sounded quite familiar to you. The phrase Son of Man appears repeatedly throughout the Christian Gospels, used again and again as a self-designation by Jesus of Nazareth, frequently in contexts explicitly connected to future judgment, heavenly authority, and vindication. Language that carries genuinely striking echoes of exactly the kind of imagery found in this section of the Book of Enoch. Here I want to be especially careful, because this is genuinely contested scholarly territory, and I don't want to overstate a connection in ways the actual evidence doesn't fully support. Scholars have debated, for well over a century now, the precise nature of the relationship between this Enochic Son of Man tradition and the New Testament's use of similar language. Some scholars argue for a fairly direct influence, suggesting that Jewish messianic expectation in the centuries immediately before and during the life of Jesus had been genuinely shaped by exactly this kind of Enochic tradition, and that early Christian writers, and possibly Jesus himself, were drawing consciously on ideas already circulating in contemporary Jewish apocalyptic thought. Other scholars are considerably more cautious, pointing out that the specific dating of the Book of Parables remains uncertain enough that we can't be entirely confident. It predates the New Testament material closely enough to have directly influenced it, and suggesting instead that both traditions might be drawing independently on a shared, broader pool of earlier Jewish apocalyptic and prophetic imagery, particularly language found in the biblical book of Daniel, which contains its own, considerably older reference to one like a son of man arriving with the clouds of heaven to receive everlasting dominion. What I think we can say with genuine confidence, without overstating the case in either direction, is this. The centuries immediately surrounding the composition of the Book of Enoch's various sections were a period of intense, creative Jewish theological reflection about coming judgment, about a heavenly figure who might vindicate the righteous and overturn corrupt earthly power, and about the ultimate restoration of proper order to a world that, as we spent so much of tonight exploring, had felt genuinely fragile, embattled, and prone to corruption for a very long time. The Book of Enoch represents one of the richest, most detailed surviving windows we have into that broader current of religious imagination, regardless of the precise, still debated details of exactly how directly it connects to later Christian tradition. I find something genuinely moving in recognizing this broader current, even setting aside the specific scholarly debates about direct influence. Across these turbulent centuries we discussed earlier tonight, foreign conquest after foreign conquest, the pressures of Hellenistic culture, the trauma of persecution under Antiochus, the ongoing anxiety about corrupted power and violence that we traced all the way back to those watchers descending Mount Hermon. Jewish communities kept returning, again and again, across multiple independent traditions and texts, to a shared hope. The hope that whatever corruption currently held power in the world, however entrenched, however overwhelming it might feel in the present moment, would not have the final word. That a righteous judgment was coming, that the oppressed would eventually be vindicated, and that proper order, however delayed, would eventually be restored. That's the same hope, really, that we've been circling around all night. In every single version of this story we've explored, from the ancient Judean scribes writing under the name of Enoch, to the Mesopotamian tablets recovered from beneath the rubble of a fallen Assyrian library, to the Greek story of Deucalion, to the patient Hindu fish guiding Manu to safety, to the quiet insistence, in nearly every tradition we discussed, that judgment, however severe, is never allowed to be the final chapter. A name in the rubble. Before we settle in completely for the night, I want to share one more small, remarkable true detail with you, because I think it's one of the most quietly astonishing discoveries connected to everything we've talked about tonight, and it ties directly back to that other ancient story we spent time with earlier, the Mesopotamian flood tablets recovered by George Smith in that London museum room. Among the fragments recovered from the caves at Qumran, alongside the Aramaic pieces of the Book of Enoch itself, scholars identified portions of a related but separate ancient work, one that never made it into the Ethiopian Enochic collection at all, and had been completely unknown to modern scholarship until these very fragments surfaced from the desert. Researchers now call it the Book of Giants, and it tells its own version of this same pre-flood story, focusing much more closely on the giant offspring of the Watchers themselves, giving several of them individual names, describing their troubled dreams and premonitions of the coming judgment, and their own dawning, horrified understanding of the destruction awaiting them. And here is the detail I find genuinely remarkable, the kind of thing that makes a quiet night of history like this one feel worth staying up a little later for. Among the names given to these giants in the Qumran fragments of the Book of Giants is one that would have made George Smith, all the way back in his London museum room, sit up immediately. One of the giants is named Gilgamesh. Another is named something very close to Humbaba, or Huwawa, the monstrous guardian figure from that same ancient Mesopotamian epic. The very story Smith had been the first person in over 2,000 years to read when he pieced together those broken clay tablets in 1872. I want you to sit with that connection for a moment, because I think it's a genuinely beautiful, unexpected thread tying together nearly everything we've discussed tonight. Jewish scribes in Second Temple Judea, writing this expanded, elaborated version of the pre-flood story sometime in the last few centuries before the Common Era, appear to have known the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh tradition well enough, whether through direct contact, cultural memory carried forward from the earlier Babylonian exile, or some other channel of transmission. Scholars are still working to fully understand that they borrowed its most famous hero's name and wove it directly into their own story of the giants destroyed in the flood. A name born in ancient Sumer and Babylon, celebrated across the Mesopotamian world for over 1,000 years before these Judean scribes ever picked up a reed pen, had traveled far enough and lingered long enough in the region's shared cultural memory to end up recorded on a scroll, sealed inside a clay jar, hidden in a desert cave above the Dead Sea, waiting patiently for nearly 2,000 years until modern scholars, working from tiny, broken fragments, finally piece the connection back together. It's a small thing in the grand scope of everything we've walked through tonight, but I think it captures something genuinely lovely about how ancient cultures, however separated by distance, language, and rival empires, were never quite as isolated from one another as we sometimes imagine. Stories traveled, names traveled. A hero remembered in the river valleys of Mesopotamia could resurface, centuries later and hundreds of miles away, reimagined as a doomed giant in a Judean scribe's telling of the world's oldest catastrophe. History, it turns out, has always been a little more connected, a little more surprising, and a little more quietly delightful than the neat, separate boxes we sometimes try to sort it into. With that last small, true wonder tucked away for the night, I think we're finally ready to let this story rest. The embers settle. We've come a long way together tonight, buddy, and if you're still with me at this point, chances are your eyes are getting heavy, and that's exactly where I hoped we'd end up. Let's just sit quietly together for a little while now, the way you might sit by a fire that's slowly burning down to embers. No more logs to add, nothing left to do but watch the last of the light settle into a warm, low glow. I want you to imagine that fire for a moment, the way the flames have stopped leaping and now just breathe, slow and orange, casting long, gentle shadows that barely move at all anymore. That's the pace we're at now. That's the pace I want to leave you at. Think back, if you can, without straining, to where we started tonight. A boy chasing a lost goat through hills the color of old bone, tossing a stone into a dark opening in a cliff, never imagining that the crack of breaking pottery he heard would eventually connect him, and connect all of us listening tonight, to a story nearly 2,200 years old. Think of the anxious, embattled scribes in Judea, writing under the borrowed name of an ancient, vanished ancestor, working through their own centuries' fears by imagining a much older, much stranger age. Think of the watchers on their snow-covered mountain, the giants consuming an exhausted world, the archangels carrying humanity's quiet cry up into heaven, and Enoch himself, walking somewhere none of us can fully picture, trembling before a throne of fire and crystal, and somehow, astonishingly, walking back out again to tell us about it. Think of the patient scribe in that small, quiet room above the Dead Sea, copying letter after careful letter by lamplight, never knowing his work would survive, sealed in clay, for nearly 19 centuries. Think of the Ethiopian monks, generation after generation, keeping this same strange, beautiful old story alive in their highland monasteries, entirely unconcerned that the rest of the world had largely forgotten it existed. Think of a Scottish traveler, well over 6 feet tall, fluent in Arabic, obsessed with the source of a great river, carrying manuscripts home across an ocean without fully knowing what treasure he was bringing back with him. And think, finally, of that boat, riding out 40 days and nights of unrelenting rain, and the small, hopeful act of releasing a single bird into an uncertain sky, watching carefully to see whether, and how, it returned. That's the story we walked through together tonight. Not a simple story. Not, I hope, one I rushed through or oversimplified for the sake of easy drama. Just a slow, careful walk through one of the strangest, oldest, most persistent stories human beings have ever told each other about power, and knowledge and judgment, and in the end about the quiet, stubborn hope that whatever floods our own lives, restoration eventually follows. Before I let you drift off completely, I want to ask you something, the way I try to every time we sit down together like this. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Whatever city, whatever country, whatever quiet corner of the world you happen to be curled up in right now. And I'd love to know what time it actually is where you are. Maybe it's the deep middle of the night for you, the way it so often is for the people who find this channel. Maybe it's early morning and you've got this playing quietly while the rest of your household is still asleep. Maybe it's the middle of your afternoon, and you're using this as a strange, cozy little escape from an ordinary day. Whatever it is, if you feel like it, drop it in the comments below. Your city, your country, your local time. I read every single one, even the ones that come in long after a video first goes up. And there's something I genuinely love about picturing this small, slow story I've been telling reaching so many completely different rooms, in so many completely different time zones all at once. And while you're down there in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's story too, if you're not too far gone towards sleep to type them out. What part of this stood out to you most? The boy and the goat and the cave. The watchers and their oath on the mountain. Enoch himself, walking somewhere none of us can fully picture. The Ethiopian monks, quietly keeping a forgotten tradition alive for 1,000 years. Or maybe it was one of those flood stories from somewhere else entirely, the fish guiding Manu to safety, or Deucalion and Pyrrha throwing stones over their shoulders. I read all of it. And honestly, some of my favorite parts of doing this channel are the quiet conversations that happen down there in the comments, long after the video itself has ended. If tonight's story, or the slow, unhurried way we told it, is something that helps you get to sleep, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you took a moment, whenever you're ready, no rush at all, to hit that subscribe button. It's a small thing, but it's the entire reason this channel is able to keep doing this, keep finding these long, forgotten corners of history and walking through them slowly, carefully, without ever needing to rush toward some dramatic ending just to hold your attention. If this has become part of your nightly routine, subscribing just makes sure you don't miss the next one, whenever it happens to arrive. I don't have a dramatic ending for you tonight, and I don't think this particular story really needs one. I think it just needs a quiet close, the kind that lets you settle, finally, all the way down. So let's do that together now. Somewhere out there tonight, in a hillside not far from where a nervous boy once threw a stone into a dark opening in a cliff, the wind is still moving quietly across land that hasn't changed all that much in 2,000 years. Somewhere in a highland monastery in Ethiopia, a page from a very old, very patient tradition is sitting exactly where it sat for generations, undisturbed, waiting for no one in particular, simply continuing to exist the way it always has. And somewhere in whatever room you're lying in right now, this small, slow story has finally reached its end, the way it always eventually does, the way every flood, every long night, every difficult stretch of any kind eventually recedes, leaving dry ground behind it, and the quiet, patient promise of another ordinary day arriving right on schedule. Let the fire settle all the way down now. Let your thoughts get slow and heavy and a little unclear at the edges, the way they do right before real sleep finally arrives. There's nowhere else you need to be right now, and nothing else you need to think about. Just this quiet room, this settled ending, and whatever gentle rest is waiting for you next. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Thank you for letting an old, strange, remarkable story about angels and giants and a very patient boat carry you all the way down toward sleep. Sleep well, buddy. I'll see you next time whenever you're ready to come back and sit by the fire again. Good night.